Good morning and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can I ask everyone to ensure that their electronic devices are switched to silent. This morning we have apologies for Marianne Burgess and we welcome Mark Ruskell, who is attending as our substitute. Our first item on the agenda is consideration of the draft Good Food Nation Specified Functions and Description, Scottish Ministers Regulations 2025. And I welcome to the meeting Marie Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, and her officials. We have Ashley Cook, who is the Deputy Director for Food and Drink, Tracy McCollin, Head of the Good Food Nation team, Lisa Nowork, the Policy Officer from the Good Food Nation team, and James Hamilton, the lawyer. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. Just to say that I'm delighted to be here to introduce this SSI on specified functions, because this is a key piece of the Good Food Nation puzzle that identifies when regard must be had to the National Good Food Nation Plan. Now, this is a new and innovative approach. It's designed to target the need to have regard to the National Plan where that's most relevant. The overall concept is quite straightforward. It's for Scottish ministers to have regard to the National Plan when carrying out specified functions or a function that falls within a specified description. But the detail of the SSI is very technical, but it is also the result of what has been extensive collaboration with policy areas right across the Scottish Government to work through the complexities of the legislative duties. Now, I would just like to start by saying that our aim is to ensure that the legislative duty is effective and focused. This innovative approach avoids a blanket legislative duty that would create unnecessary bureaucracy that has no meaningful impact. Now, the content of the SSI is intended to provide a focus for better, more joined-up policy making in relation to food. Now, we are going to assess, monitor and no doubt likely adjust the policy areas contained in the SSI to ensure that the National Plan makes the greatest possible impact. The SSI sets out where the Scottish Ministers have the power to undertake a function in relation to food, and this takes two forms. So we have Schedule 1, which sets out specific legislative provisions which contain functions of Scottish Ministers in relation to food. In order to enable non-statutory functions to be caught, Schedule 2 sets out the specified descriptions. This signals when regard must be had to the National Good Food Nation Plan and provides a targeted and focused approach to the development of food policy. Now, because this is a new approach, this is also the reason why the draft SSI is very different from the consultation draft, which I know the committee had some questions about. Now, the changes are reflective of ultimately our own evolving understanding of how specified functions and descriptions can be set out to ensure that they relate to the legislative powers and functions of Scottish ministers in relation to food. Now, we have analysed and considered every suggestion that we received during the consultation for input to the SSI, but the approach that we've taken is that policy areas that are mentioned in the National Good Food Nation Plan are reflected where possible in the instrument. Now, you may notice what appear to be some gaps in some instances. That's because other legislation already provides what is in essence a specified function outside of this instrument. In other cases, it's because a general duty to have regard to a broad policy area already exists, and so it was felt unnecessary to duplicate that in the SSI. Identifying the correct level of specificity was a careful balancing act. The SSI has also been developed in close collaboration with policy officials across Scottish Government and as well as with input from our ministerial colleagues. So that's to ensure that there is awareness of the have regard duty from the get-go, but also to ensure that we have the required buy-in for effective cross-government working going forward. The current functions and descriptions captured under the SSI cover a broad range of issues that are relevant to food policy. I think this does provide a really good starting point which can and will be built on going forward. And with that, Convener, I'm happy to take any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. This has been a long process. The Good Food Nation has been something that's been talked about for over a decade. And indeed, this committee did a huge amount of work right at the beginning of this parliamentary session. But sadly, we were unable to properly scrutinise the plan, given a lack of capacity and our time, I should say. But in our call for views, stakeholders have been highly critical of the SSI, including the Scottish Food Commission. Lots of concern around the governance and accountability. And indeed, the Scottish Food Commission has suggested that it conflates the desire for specificity and that of being narrow. So there is some confusion in how we've arrived where we are. So can you explain what your approach has been? And given that some specified functions and specified descriptions appear in one list and one schedule, I should say, but not another, for example, crofting. So is there a risk that by including some functions and not others, that there may be omissions in practice?
There's quite a lot to pick up in that question, so I will try to work through it as best I can. I absolutely appreciate the points that you've made, Convener, about the amount of work that's gone into the Good Food Nation plan, as well as the legislation which started the start of this term, and obviously we had the Act in 2022. And even though I appreciate the committee took evidence in relation to the publication of the draft Good Food Nation plan, I want to assure you that both myself and officials appeared in front of 2 other committees of the Scottish Parliament, which I think was actually welcome to see other areas have that interest in the Good Food Nation work and to go through that scrutiny in some detail. And of course I will keep the committee updated when we publish the final version of that plan based on the recommendations that had come through that scrutiny from other committees too. I think I do just want to reiterate the point, first of all, though, that when it comes to specified functions and descriptions, it can appear quite difficult or technical to understand and go through. But I think what we are doing is an innovative approach. I think it's actually quite an exciting approach. I think that we do have regard duties in other pieces of legislation. This is really about putting that have regard duty into practice to make sure that we do have that joined up policy working across the piece and across government, and that the Good Food Nation plan and its outcomes are being considered in the development of policies. Now, it's been set out in the way that it has between the 2 different schedules. Schedule 1 obviously covers the specified functions. That is where there is a specific legislative power or regulation-making duty where ministers would be expected to have regard to the Good Food Nation plan in relation to the exercise of those. But of course, there are a number of other non-statutory areas where we would want to consider the Good Food Nation plan, and that's what's covered in the descriptions as set out there. As I set out in my opening remarks, of course, we have tried to be comprehensive. This has involved extensive working across government. We've listened to what came through the consultation, had that engagement with stakeholders as well. But again, I think it was about trying to get that balance. If you have a duty that's too broad, then the concern is that it becomes more of a tick box exercise rather than addressing this in a meaningful way and considering it in a meaningful way. So that's why the approach has been taken. But again, I would just want to emphasise this is a starting point, it's not the finishing point. And if it emerges as the work develops that there are areas that have been missed, then of course we would look to add that to further legislation going forward and bring forward another SSI.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. In your response, you said you tried to be comprehensive, but one damning feature of this SSI is the policy note. It runs to just 1.5 pages. I've seen SSIs which were considerably less impactful on, good food production, which ran and had more explanation about how the government arrived at its policies. So why is there so little information surrounding this SSI, given how broad it is? 1.5 pages, I think, is probably the smallest policy note we've had in any of the legislation we've considered in this committee in the last 4 years.
I mean, in relation to, the information is there set out in the schedule, and I think it's obviously to set that out quite clearly and concisely, the powers and the functions and the descriptions that would be intending to consider there as well. And obviously, if there are any further questions in relation to that, and I've obviously provided the letter to committee as well to try and address some of the questions that the committee had and provide more information there that I hope was helpful in answering some of those questions.
Okay, thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks. Good morning. Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you, Cabinet Secretary. It's just to build on what you were saying in your opening about how comprehensive the list is of what needs to be contained. In the letter that you wrote to the committee, it says that some functions but not others were chosen to be included, And in relation to agriculture and planning, for example, the Scottish Government said that these are covered by specified functions on the National Planning Framework, and I understand other legislation that you've mentioned will cover some of the items as well. And it is, I think, it's good that we are working cross-portfolio. Last night I hosted a 10-year anniversary Food Standards Scotland event, and there was loads of different stakeholders in the room. Dennis Overton was here from the Food Commission, as well as others from the Food Foundation. So it was very wide-ranging as well. So I'm interested in, I suppose, the approach about taking agriculture and planning as examples. Is it sufficient to have regard to the Good Food Nation plan only when producing another high-level plan, as opposed to when exercising other functions that have practical effects, such as issuing guidance, setting eligibility criteria and so on?
Yes, I mean, I think that when you're looking at the SSI, I feel like that's probably one area that looks like it's a glaring omission. But as I outlined, or tried to outline in my opening comments there, what can appear as omissions in some areas are because that they are covered in other pieces of legislation. So that I think in relation to agriculture, as an example, there was the specific reference to the Good Food Nation plan that was made as an amendment to the Good Food Nation Act. And to give reference to the Good Food Nation plan in relation to the Rural Support Plan. So again, it doesn't make sense to necessarily duplicate references that exist elsewhere, and because that duty already exists in that piece of legislation, that's why it isn't replicated here, because it will still, the Good Food Nation plan and its outcomes will still have to be considered there. I think there are a few other areas that you've outlined there that hopefully have been able to address in the tables and the information that were provided to committee as to what could look like omissions, but either specific duties are covered elsewhere. And also, I would just highlight in relation to the specified descriptions, obviously that can cover quite a broad range of areas, and including the development of policy and legislation in those areas too. So I think we have captured the majority of areas that are specific, as I outlined previously, that are specifically referenced in the plan itself. But again, some of those other omissions are covered elsewhere.
And the Population Health Framework mentions the Good Food Nation plan as well. That's part of, this whole ability to address our food system, for example, and support improved population health. So I'm just looking at the Good Food Nation plan language within the Population Health Framework as well.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think that's where it was important in giving evidence to the Health Committee. I know that the Population Health Framework was raised through that, and a lot of the work that's been taken forward there. And there has been close working between both the Good Food Nation team and teams in health policy as well, to ensure that there is that cross-portfolio working in those areas.
Okay, thanks.
Just on that, Cabinet Secretary, the instrument appears not to cover issues like food insecurity and diet-related illness, which, from the evidence we took, 4 years ago, were central to a Good Food Nation. Why has that been excluded?
It's not that it's been excluded. Again, when you look through the list of the specified functions, and I think, again, through the tables that I provided to the committee as well, the specified functions relate to very specific powers and the exercise of those specific powers, but the descriptions we feel that are set out capture some of the broad areas and where they impact on food policy. And just on the agricultural side again, several respondents, including the the Food Coalition and NFUS, highlighted that agriculture is not referred to as a policy area under specific descriptions. Why would it be excluded from a policy area? Again, it's because there's already reference to the Good Food Nation plan and how we give consideration to that in the ARC Act from last year. So that's why the reference just hasn't been duplicated here. Again, the Good Food Nation, the Rural Support Plan doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover a lot of the things that you would expect the Good Food Nation. So does that not create a gap? I don't believe it does create a gap, because First of all, that will be the key strategic document. And when you look at Section 2 in the ARC Act, and I think what the Rural Support Plan has to give consideration to and set out, I believe that that is quite comprehensive. I also think it's important that that key strategic document and being able to judge that and assess that against and have regard to the Good Food Nation plan and outcomes in development of that at that key strategic level is really important, because then that means that is built into the development of the areas that the Rural Support Plan has to cover. But again, an important point on that is, if we are developing policy in these areas and it's apparent that there is a gap, through the monitoring that we'll be doing, then again, we would look to pick that up. It's within nobody's interest for there to be any key missing areas within this legislation. So that's where the monitoring and how we're assessing the impact of it is going to be really important going forward.
Okay, thank you. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, in writing to or responding to the committee about this issue, you highlighted areas, and you mentioned it again just now, I think, areas which are not specified in this SSI because they're already specified elsewhere in other legislation. So can I ask how you ensure clarity on that issue, given that we're talking about, as you've mentioned, things that are specified in different pieces of legislation?
I think that's where, as I've talked about the monitoring and how we'll be looking at that going forward, is going to be really critical to make sure that the have regard duty is having effect in the way that it's intended. So I'll hand over to officials who will be able to say a bit more about that. But again, through the development of this SSI, through the development of the plan, I think there has been that key working across government, building those relationships with different policy teams. Again, that's how the functions and the description schedule has been collated, which I think has already developed that wider understanding. But I don't know if, Tracy, you want to say a bit more about the monitoring work, which hopefully will provide more reassurance on that front.
Yes, so I would say that the work to develop this SSI has already started that process, in terms of there was a lot of cross-policy working, cross-portfolio working as well, so there's a really good awareness of the way in which the National Good Food Nation plan takes legal effect through these specified functions and specified descriptions. And as we've been having those conversations with colleagues, we've been testing how best to monitor, because we don't want to add additional bureaucratic burden. We want something to be quite effective, and also taking account of the fact that policies can take some time to develop. So having check-in points with the Good Food Nation team at the beginning of the policy work on anything that's related to food, offering help through the Good Food Nation team in terms of putting policy colleagues in touch with other areas that might be of relevance to the development of the new policy or legislation or guidance or whatever it is they're working on. And at the end of the process, recording how that have regard has been had and which specified functions and descriptions have been used. So by that mechanism, we'll be able to understand which ones are being used on a regular basis, which ones may not have been used, whether there are gaps, whether our policy colleagues are highlighting something that should be added to the regulations. And throughout that process, also, the Good Food Nation team will be acting as a central point, so that people always know who to get in touch with, and we can put them in touch with other policy areas across the Scottish Government. So, given what you've said about those conversations with the sector, can I ask, in that case, what would be the implications for the wider good food agenda if the Parliament were not to pass this instrument?
It means that the have regard duty wouldn't have effect in relation to these policy areas if the instrument wasn't passed by Parliament today. I think, again, I would just want to make the point that this is an innovative approach that we're trying to develop. And now I understand it may not be perfect to start off with. It may appear that there are gaps later on as we look to further develop this work, because it is new. The monitoring is going to be important. But I think that this provides a strong starting point. If gaps do emerge, we can always bring forward another piece, or another instrument to add to those areas. But I do believe that we have a strong starting point right across government with the different policy areas that are of relevance to the plan. So I would hope that the committee feels in a position to support this today, so that we can only then look to build on this in the future.
Thank you, Convener.
Just on that again, given that the feedback has been critical, and I know you've said you've taken time to do this, but This is only, in the Secretary of Legislation, this is affirmative and thereafter it's negative. So the ability for Parliament to scrutinise any further instruments on this is somewhat limited. Have you felt under pressure because the Act specifies that you need to publish the plan before the end of December? This is part and parcel of that. And given longer times and the feedback we've had on this instrument, would you have considered withdrawing it, reviewing it and then bringing it back to be what I think a lot of stakeholders would suggest is more fit for purpose?
I don't think more time necessarily would have assisted in that, and also because I think we've also faced criticism because of the time to develop the plan. And again, I would say from the point of consultation that we undertook on the specified functions last year, our own understanding of how this would work in practice has been evolving through that time as well. I think when you look through all the different comments that have come from different stakeholders, I mean, ultimately, this is how we put the Good Food Nation plan and its outcomes to practical effect across different policy areas, and it's how we work within government to ensure that it's having the impact that it needs. And I think some stakeholders would have wanted to see a broader duty apply, which again, we've tried to get the balance right here between it not being too broad and becoming a tick box exercise to other areas that people feel may be excluded. But again, I think we have tried to strike that right balance, and as I was just outlining in my response to Alistair Allen there, I think that this provides a strong starting point for us going forward, because we can only look to build on it from here.
Thank you. Rhoda, did you have a supplementary on this? No. Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Yes, Cabinet Secretary, I think I understand what you're trying to say. Even in my short time in Parliament, though, I think I've heard various ministers and Cabinet Secretaries say it's a strong starting point. But I agree with what the convener was just saying. The risk is, once it leaves committee, that it's really difficult for us on committee or Parliament to really have a say on where this goes. So how do you, given, because it's quite a broad range of stakeholders that have raised concerns over this, although I accept you're right, you've got a bit of a starting point there. How can they feel comfortable then? How can I be reassured that actually their views are going to be taken into account as soon as possible, so that those lists can be amended?
Well, I think there's a number of different things that can be done in relation to that. First of all, just to say, we will of course be open to any further suggestions for additions that people feel may need to be added in future. I think it's important that, given this is new and it's a novel approach, we need to embed it and see how it's working ourselves. So there's the monitoring that the Good Food Nation team would be undertaking, the mechanisms that would be established for that are going to be important. But I mean, again, there's whether that's recommendations that the committee has, there will be review points in the Good Food Nation Act as well, where no doubt this could be picked up in any evidence or any scrutiny that's undertaken in the plan. If there are any suggestions that are emerging from the committee or from other stakeholders, or indeed the Scottish Food Commission at any point in relation to that, of course we're open to considering it. But I think a good piece of work in that engagement has been in also working with stakeholders as to explain a bit more about how we work within government and how the specified functions are intended to work in practice and that have regard duty. So I would say that we're open to that consideration, to that scrutiny in future, and again open to any recommendations that might come forward. But as I say, I believe that we have covered the most critical areas in relation to the Good Food Nation plan as it stands at the moment, captured those critical functions as well as the wider descriptions. And yes, more than happy to keep the committee engaged on how the monitoring is progressing, as well as at those specific review points that are set out in legislation too.
I mean, it's up to the convener, but I mean, I would be quite happy to hear, I think, more as this progresses, given the concern. Just out of interest, have you got any meetings arranged with some of these stakeholders to sort of have some of these discussions around how they feel this should be changed moving forward?
I mean, in terms, I think there is already that regular engagement between the Good Food Nation team and our wider stakeholders as well, and obviously that's been taking place through the development of this SSI. So I think
apart from the fact we've got concerns here.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. I appreciate that, but again, those discussions have been taking place with the team, so I don't know if there's more that anybody would want to add in relation to that. Right, is that covered? Yeah.
Okay. So I've got a question here. Your response to the committee's letter states that there is a plan to introduce a reporting mechanism for the duty to have regard, and that will be done by the Good Food Nation team. Can I just ask, how will this team oversee that duty, and will decision-making processes around the duty be publicly communicated to ensure transparency?
Again, I'll hand over to Tracy, who can give a bit more information about that, how that's actually going to work in practice and what some of the plans that are developing there.
So I spoke before about the fact that the Good Food Nation team will act as a central point, and it's still under discussion with our policy colleagues. As I also mentioned, we don't want to put extra bureaucracy on here, but likely some form of tracker that would enable us to keep a record of which specified functions were being used and how they had regard to during the development of that policy. I suppose because it's a new approach at the moment, we're not entirely sure how that information will be provided and how it can be recorded. So I think we're keeping an open mind as to how best to be able to do that. And in terms of the way in which that will become available, I think one of the things we're hoping to do at the reporting points and also the review and revision is to take a look at how the specified functions are working in practice. Again, I'm not exactly sure how that will be put into those reports, the 2-year reports that are required by the Good Food Nation Act, but we're, again, undertaking discussions with colleagues as to the best way to do that, partly because I think policy development will vary across different policy areas. Some will take a short time, some will take a long time. I think some will change depending on what happens during the development of that policy, so I think it will be quite a task to be able to track everything, and we want to be able to do that in an efficient way. That means that when we're coming to our 2-year reports and also the revision and the review and revision of the National Good Food Nation Plan, that we have the information to hand in the most effective way possible in order to inform decisions and changes that might be needed there.
Did you have sort of pre-ideas around this? I mean, in the build-up to the Good Food Nation plan and everything and all the work that's gone on for years, you must have thought, because have regard is pretty common, isn't it, nowadays? So is there other methods that are used in other laws that, that you can use in this?
Not like this, because this is the first time this approach is being taken. So that's why what we're talking about is, you're right, a have regard duty isn't new across legislation.
Nope.
I appreciate we discussed that in other bills that I've been in front of committee to discuss too. But I think the way that this one is operating is new, and that's why the approach is different. Now, I completely understand the committee will have an interest, as well as wider stakeholders too, about how this is operating in practice. But that's where I think what Tracy has outlined and what we've been talking about and how we report on that is going to be important, and I think we want to be transparent about that and how this is going to work in practice.
Okay, fine.
Thank you. A question from Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. Thanks for your answers so far. Cabinet Secretary, can you set out for us what the role of the Scottish Food Commission in monitoring the duty to have regard to the Good Food Nation Plan?
Yes, well, the Scottish Food Commission obviously has a specific role which is set out in relation to the which is set out in the legislation. Now, there isn't a specific role in relation to the Scottish Food Commission and the have regard duty, but again, just as I'd outlined earlier, if there were any suggestions or they wanted to do any work on that, or they had any suggestions about areas they felt that we should consider in future, we'd of course be open to that and to any recommendations they would have. But as I say, their specific duties and functions don't specifically relate to this area.
So do you see that as being an ongoing dialogue about what their role might be?
Oh, well, absolutely. I would expect us to have a very close working relationship with the Scottish Food Commission. I think, given the role that they have in the scrutiny of the plan, I think it makes absolute sense for us to do that. And again, I mean, they're independent. They can look at their own work too, but I would expect that we'd have that close engagement and discussion. Yeah, and Ash wants to come in on that point.
If I could, thank you. Yeah, just to emphasise, I do meet regularly with Dennis Overton, the chair of the Food Commission, or the head of the Food Commission, who was referenced earlier. And I wanted to make the point as well about there are set points in the legislation where the Food Commission are going to be issuing sort of public progress reports, if you want to call it that, on the government's performance around the Good Food Nation and our targets. And while it's obviously for the Commission to decide how to conduct that work, I would expect them to be looking at the interaction between the plan and the specified functions and how that's working, and if there's anything that needs to change as well. And I would imagine that would sort of be a moment in time for a conversation to be happening, whether it's a committee via these reporting mechanisms from the Commission. And I would imagine any government at the time would want to respond to that too, and lay out its experiences around the specified functions and how it's actually worked in practice.
So do you see this as being quite a positive relationship that going forward, you know, depending on what happens and how the legislation is rolled out, that they will be able to influence their role?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I think that engagement, as Ash has outlined, is very much going to be ongoing throughout this. And I would say, just in general, in relation to the plan as well, it's not a case of, oh, the plan is published and that's it. I mean, there's so much work that will continue to go on in the background there, so many pieces of work that are ongoing at the moment, which, you know, would already be looking ahead to future iterations of the plan and looking ahead to the reporting and reviews too. So, again, this is the starting point for this new area, but that engagement and any recommendations that we get from the Scottish Food Commission, of course, we'd be working closely with.
There was also a question mark about schedules being kept up to date. Is that something that they would have a role in?
Well, again, their duties don't specifically relate to that area, but through the work that Tracy's outlined, I think through that monitoring, we'd be wanting to make sure that we are capturing some of those duties. I appreciate, I mean, you only have to look ahead to the next few months, and I think the amount of legislation that the Parliament is going to be dealing with. So I think there is that risk that, you know, are we missing any duties here or that we would then need to bring back or consider in future? But I think that's where the specified descriptions are important, because they are broader areas, they're all encompassing. So any legislation would also be covered by those broad descriptions that are set out in that list too. But of course, it's something that we would be keeping a close eye on, and to make sure that we're capturing any new duties or any new powers.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary, can you maybe give us an indication, because it's not set out anywhere in the legislation or in the guidance notes, how often these update reports will be published?
Well, again, I think there are specific review points within the legislation for the Good Food Nation plan, so I think that's what we're setting. Those could act as points where we would be reporting on how the powers have been exercised as well. But there's also the work that the Tracy and the Good Food Nation team are taking forward through that engagement. So it's not necessarily a case of waiting till that specific review point, because I think if it appeared or transpired there was another area where it felt it was appropriate for us to add to that list, we would bring forward another instrument within that time rather than waiting until that specific review period, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Rhoda Grant.
Just following on from those questions, the Scottish Food Coalition also talked about what you actually mentioned yourself, is that there are bills going through the Parliament just now that are not going to be included in this. So almost, if we pass it, it'll be out of date, because, you know, this afternoon we're looking at Natural Environment Bill. Should we be adding a clause into the Natural Environment Bill that means that it has to, the functions have to have regard to the Good Food Nation plan? So I guess, should we be updating all legislation, or how often do you expect to be bringing forward a new SSI on this?
Again, it's not possible for me to set out timeframes for that, because I think it just very much depends how the situation evolves. But as I've outlined, I think given the specified descriptions, we hope that that would future-proof things to a certain extent, given that they cover such a description covers a broader area and would include the development of future policy. But what I would say is too that, I mean, even though the SSI and the instrument hasn't been passed yet, there has also been that ongoing engagement and dialogue with the Good Food Nation team and other policy areas across government, I think, in development of some of these key areas as well, to ensure that the plan and its outcomes are being given that consideration.
I don't think we have a stakeholder that is really happy with the approach of the SSI, and I think the disappointment comes from the Good Food Nation bill and plan were supposed to be overarching. That food was of interest to everybody because of health, because of the economy. It touches so many aspects of life. This SSI seems to actually narrow the whole process by specifically mentioning some things. But again, it doesn't provide a full picture because there are bits of legislation. So unless you were totally immersed in legislation, you pick up this SSI and you've missed half of what the Good Food Nation plan is supposed to be doing. And then you see a narrowing of where it actually is relevant. I wonder, had you consulted on the draft, whether you would have taken this away and taken a different approach, because it seems that this pleases nobody and doesn't really meet the aspirations of the bill.
But in some ways, though, I don't think it could, because I think what some people would be looking for is really to broaden that power. And this is a very technical instrument in many ways, and ultimately it's about trying to change how we work across government, which I think, again, it can appear as if it might be too narrow, but we're looking at the very specific exercise of powers to actually make sure this has a meaningful impact. Now, you could reference broad pieces of legislation, but again, the fear with that is if we take that broad approach in terms of consideration of the Good Food Nation plan, it becomes so broad that it then almost becomes meaningless in that tick box exercise, which I think we are really keen to avoid, because we want to show that in the exercise specific functions that have that relevance to the Good Food Nation plan, how the outcomes within the Good Food Nation plan are being considered, and then we're seeing that practical effect from that. So again, this is about fundamentally changing how we work across government, and it is a new innovative approach. So I would disagree that it's too narrow. For us, again, it's about getting that balance, which hopefully in the table that I'd set out to committee explains some of that. There are some areas, I think, where people would have wanted to see a whole piece of legislation covered. We've outlined why the specific powers within each of those areas. There are other areas that are so broad that don't necessarily relate to food, like when you look at procurement as an example of that. Again, it could be a whole broad brush approach, but of course food procurement is more specific, which is why we've taken the approach that we have there. So again, I think we've struck the right balance, but of course the danger with that is in trying to get that you end up not keeping anybody happy. But again, we can only look to monitor this, to add to it in the future, to ensure that we're covering all those bases once we look at how this is working in practice. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is make sure that the Good Food Nation plan has a practical impact, and that's what we're trying to implement through this instrument.
But by being so narrow, it misses maybe crucial aspects, for example, planning. We all know that if you live in a deprived area, the chances are you're going to have an expensive corner shop and not a kind of more affordable supermarket. Planning is crucial to how we implement all of this. It just feels that an awful lot of that is missing from the plan. We're not taking the holistic approach that we had hoped would come forward from this.
No, I agree with what you're saying in terms of the impact of planning, but again, it's about trying to make sure that we are addressing some of those issues in the most specific way and where that would have an impact on what we've set out in the Good Food Nation plan in terms of how that's taken into consideration. So, again, I can only repeat what I've said in terms of us trying to strike that balance. But if it turns out in practice there's an area we've missed there, that in development of policy in a specific area we haven't picked up, we need to make sure that it's covered, we would bring forward another instrument to try and address that. But that's where the monitoring and the work that's taking place across government is going to be really important in picking that up.
And just, given that that's the case, would it not be better to withdraw this instrument and come back with something that was more overarching?
I wouldn't agree with that, again, because we've taken the approach that we have so that it's not too broad stroke, that the implementation of it doesn't mean anything and it's not working in practice. This has been a long ongoing process. We first consulted on this earlier last year. So I think I wouldn't want to withdraw this and delay it any further, because we can only look to improve it from here. I believe that we've covered all the key bases that are set out in the Good Food Nation plan. And again, we can only look to add to that in future. But I would be really concerned if the instrument wasn't passed, because I think we have a strong basis here and I think it just delays the plan being taken into consideration.
Are there any other considerations as why it needs to be passed today? Is it because of the constraints within the Act that you need to publish within 3 months of the consultation?
No, I don't believe so. I mean, again, we consulted on this a long time ago. There's been so much work that's gone on, both in the development of the plan and consideration of these matters, which is why I think it's important that we've brought this forward when we have. And I can only repeat what I've said in terms of how the approach that we've taken and striking that balance.
So there's no legal rush to pass this SSI now?
Again, I would have to look for advice in terms of what's set out in legislation in terms of us bringing this forward. But
no, the legislation sets out a timetable for laying of the Good Food Nation plan, which ministers have complied with. It doesn't set out a specific timetable for laying these regulations, so there's nothing within the Act that requires it to happen now, so that's not the reason for bringing it forward now.
Okay, thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up there on future edits of the SSI. I wondered what kind of triggers the government will be keeping an eye on to decide whether to come forward with any revisions or any additions to what we're looking at today.
Again, there'll be the monitoring work that Tracy and her team are looking to establish in those reporting mechanisms. First of all, as to how the specified functions and descriptions that we have in the instrument are being applied, but there will be that ongoing consideration discussion between teams to see if there is anything that could be flagged as an area, either an omission. And again, at that point, it could be at that point that we discover there is an omission that we would then bring forward an instrument. But then, as we've already outlined in relation to the review periods that are set out for the Good Food Nation plan and the reporting that we would have to do on that, that may make sense to consider it at that point when there could be more evidence available as to when that could be brought forward.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell.
I mean, the whole Parliament is currently considering a draft climate change plan. It seems odd that under this SSI, ministers won't be having regard to climate change under this SSI or social security. So I wonder why there's such big omissions at this point, because if the whole point of this is policy coherence and drawing all these important threads together, I mean, now is the time, isn't it, particularly with climate change, that we should be looking at what is a good food nation, and ministers should be thinking across portfolios in these kind of areas. So I'm not sure why there are such big omissions at this point.
Again, because in some of those areas they're already picked up in specified descriptions and functions that are specified functions elsewhere. And I've outlined that in response to the letter to committee, I think specifically on climate change and in some areas of social security too. Again, we've picked up the areas with that direct link to food. We didn't want to duplicate what existed elsewhere, but again, we've picked up those key areas that were referenced in the plan through, and I believe that we've covered that through the descriptions and functions as we've set out. And it's not saying that those areas aren't important. Of course, they're all completely interlinked, and we reference that in the Good Food Nation plan as well. And there is that wider engagement between teams in recognition of just the interlinked nature of these policies.
Right. So if the schedules were updated at some point in the future government, would that potentially include climate change and social security, or is it job done for those areas?
I mean, no, again, it's not a case of we've drawn a line under anything and nothing will be considered in future, and I hope I've been able to make that point quite clearly today. But it's, well, what is the specified power that would need to be exercised that we'd be considering to look to add to the specified function, or what is the description where we would need to consider that in a non-statutory way, I think would be the key considerations of that. You could take those very broad brush areas. Not every specific policy in relation to that is linked directly to food. So again, it's consideration of all these matters, and that's, again, just coming back to the monitoring. If there is any specific omission, any exercises of power that we feel is missed or we need to pick up, then that's what we would look to add.
Okay, so were these aspects considered in the development of the draft climate change plan?
Well, again, what you'll have seen in relation to well, the overall approach that we've taken. I've highlighted already just how just the engagement that's taken place so far, the consultation that we've had in these overall areas. But of course, I think in relation to the draft climate change plan and the policies that we've taken forward there, I mean, I can say even from a ministerial perspective, in relation to my own portfolio, the strong links to all the key policy areas that we've covered in the climate change plan, I'd be wanting to make sure that the Good Food Nation outcomes are considered in relation to the development of those policies that we've put forward. Again, there isn't anything specifically listed here. I appreciate what can look like emissions, but that's not to say that those discussions haven't taken place or those considerations haven't happened.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Tim Eagle.
I might be going back a wee bit here, but I'm trying to get, I don't know about you, Cabinet Secretary, my head has been so filled with land reform and natural environment that it's hard to come back to this. But so can I, Mr Hamilton was talking there about timescales. So you laid the draft plan, you had 60 days, sitting days for us to review that. You then have to lay the final plan within 3 months. But the duty to have regard doesn't have a timescale attached. Is that my understanding correct on that? As in, there is nothing that prohibits you from taking this SSI away, doing a bit more discussion with some of the stakeholders that have raised concern, and then relaying that again. That wouldn't cause problems for any of the timescales within the Act.
It wouldn't cause us any legal issues in terms of that,
No.
and it would be a legal duty that we weren't complying with.
Yeah.
We'd be left in the position that we would have a National Good Food Nation plan in which we had no legal obligation to have regard to when carrying out specified functions or descriptions of functions. So it's not. I wouldn't say it's not without problems. There's not a breach of a legal duty involved in that.
True, but that's the important point here, isn't there? Because it's not ideal, but it is possible, without breaking in any parts of the Act, that we could say, look, actually, there's been widespread... Because I guess this is quite a novel approach, isn't it, the Good Food Nation Act? And it is cross-cutting. And I actually do sympathise slightly with some of your points about practicality. Like, how do you implement this across loads of government departments in different ways? But saying that, we've got to take into account the concerns that have been raised by the stakeholders. So does it not seem slightly sensible then just to say, well, OK, let's go and have another sit down round the table, thrash this out with some of the stakeholders, just all the stuff you've been saying to us this morning, to basically say that to them, get them on board and make sure we're all heading in the same direction rather than pulling in two directions?
I appreciate the concern that's been raised. I think my concern would also be that, you know, if the instrument was withdrawn, we went back and had those conversations, could I still come back categorically and say that 100% of people are 100% happy with everything that we've set out in the SSI? I don't think that would be possible because, again, we have tried to strike that balance. This is, again, about the technical aspects of how we put this plan into effect and working across government, and that's why it's designed in the way that it is, over exercise of very specific powers. And again, it is a strong starting point. I'm concerned about the gap there would be if it was withdrawn, just as has been outlined, that we would have a plan, but then the practical implementation of that, it doesn't need to be given regard to. And I think all we can look to do is ensure that we are monitoring, that we can build on this SSI in future if there are any key areas we feel are missing in the exercise of those powers. But again, I feel that we'd had the consultation a couple of years ago. We, of course, have that ongoing dialogue with stakeholders. And again, we have tried to strike the right balance with what we've brought forward.
And I accept that, but the first part of that, the duty to have regard to, that will only be true for as long as it takes you to come back with the SSI again. So there might be a short period of time where you're right, you have a final plan in place, but without that have regard duty. But as soon as you put the new SSI back and we all approve it and it goes through Parliament, then that kicks in, does it not?
Again, but that presumes that you could take that away, do that work and have that done before the end of the parliamentary term, which I think isn't a given, just given how much legislation that we have.
That's really a fair point.
Again, I would stress that there has been a lot of ongoing dialogue. I appreciate the concerns that have been expressed by stakeholders. But again, some of that we wouldn't be able to satisfy because I think some areas that came through the plan or that came through that consultation or that engagement would mean a far more broader duty that could essentially mean that the implementation of this and that have regard duty has less effect. So I believe we've got the right balance, and I hope the committee feels it's in a position to be able to support this today. And of course, we'll welcome any scrutiny and any recommendations going forward as to how we can look to build on that. But I'm concerned about the gap that could potentially exist, because I do think we've got a strong foundation to build on that we can only look to improve from here.
Okay.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. So in our Health Committee work, we talk about the non-communicable diseases. 32% of people in Scotland are obese. We've got challenges with type 2 diabetes. We've got kids that are not as tall as kids in other European countries because of malnourishment. So if we pass this instrument today, that allows the cross-government portfolio working to take place, because it is a complex issue in order to address food system, in order to support a healthier nation. That is the purpose of the instrument, correct, with the different cross-portfolio, cross-government departments that need to work together so that we can tackle the issues I've listed.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are some broader areas that you could look at and say that's not covered. But when you actually look at the specified descriptions, I think it picks up some of those key areas and how policies, strategies or any legislation that would be developed, and how that would, the Good Food Nation plan would have to be taken into consideration in relation to that. I mean, when you're talking about nutritional recommendations, information requirements and diet-related health conditions, that would be, again, is picked up as part of the specified descriptions. So, again, ensuring that we are giving it the due consideration. And I can only reiterate what I've said previously about, I think, particularly the strong relationships that exist between health and food policy, and the amount of ongoing work that has been going on between policy teams to make sure that we are working together across the piece and ensuring that the plan is given due consideration in those policy areas.
Okay.
I'm just a bit confused by Emma Harper's intervention there. I can understand why she's taken the line she's taken. However, the concerns were from the Food Commission that this has weak environmental and health integrations, and questions whether the government can deliver a good food nation while effectively in this ignores climate obligations and public health outcomes. It's almost contrary to what we've just heard, that there are failings or shortcomings in tying in public health outcomes and climate within the due regard to the schedules.
I mean, again, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because you look at some of the areas that are captured by the specified descriptions. Again, it's including those areas that have that direct link and where there would be the greatest effect. I've just outlined some of that in response to Emma Harper, and also in relation to some of those other areas, we're just not duplicating functions or descriptions that exist elsewhere in legislation either.
Okay, thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. You said earlier on there were still ongoing discussions with stakeholders. Can you tell me what engagement you've had with the seafood industry?
Again, well, I'd had engagement with the seafood industry fairly recently in relation to a specific engagement with another MSP, but again, that was about a more specific matter. Officials have regular engagement, but not just within the Good Food Nation team, but more broadly across the piece and other policy areas with our seafood stakeholders as well. So again, these meetings and engagement can cover a wide variety of matters, as well as what we're discussing today.
We had in the call for reviews, the committee's call for reviews, a response from Shetland Fishermen's Association, who said that the Good Food Nation framework is only meaningful if it recognises seafood as a pillar of Scotland's food production. Is seafood recognised as a pillar of Scottish food production?
Well, absolutely. I think we recognise that in the Good Food Nation plan itself, just the importance of our marine environment, our marine industries, and of course seafood is a low carbon source of protein, which, and again, the production of that and the role that our fishermen play in that is of course critical, but I do feel like we do recognise that within the National Good Food Nation plan.
Yeah, there's also seafood, and it covers aquaculture as well.
Yes,
and the
absolutely.
recognition of how important that is, but it feels it's a bit like agriculture has maybe just been left off the list.
Well, if you're talking specifically in relation to the specified functions, and in relation to that, again, we've tried to capture that at a strategic level through the National Marine Plan. I think that's where we have reference to that within the specified functions and descriptions, which again is taking it at that more strategic level. But I do think there's that wider recognition within the plan itself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? No. We now move on to agenda item 2, which is formal consideration of the motion to approve the instrument. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move motion S6M 19472.
Formally moved, Convener.
Does any member wish to debate the motion? No. Is the committee content to recommend approval of this instrument? No, we are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of supporting the instrument, please raise your hands now. Those opposed? And the result of the vote is 4 for, 5 against. The motion, therefore, has not been agreed. Finally, is the committee content to delegate authority to me to sign off a report on this instrument? We are. That completes our consideration of the instrument. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for attending today's meeting. I now suspend the meeting for 10 minutes to allow changeover of witnesses. I suspend this meeting. So our remaining item on the agenda today is consideration of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill at Stage 2. As we have quite a few groupings to get through, may I ask everyone to be as succinct as possible when speaking to their amendments. And I welcome back Mary Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, who is supported by Scottish Government officials. And I welcome other members who are participating in Stage 2 this morning. Officials seated at the table are here to support the Cabinet Secretary but are not permitted to speak in the debates on amendments. As we have a member participating remotely, I will briefly explain the procedure for hybrid Stage 2 proceedings. So if at any stage we lose connection, we will suspend proceedings. Emma Roddick's camera will be kept on at all times, and Emma Roddick should raise her hand at the appropriate point for each vote. So I now move on to the amendments, and I call Amendment 201 in the name of Ross Greer, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. And I draw members' attention to the procedural information on this group as shown in the groupings. Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 201 and speak to the amendments and all amendments in the group.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. As members know, I'm standing in for Ariane Burgess this morning, so I will be speaking to Ariane Burgess's amendments, Ross Greer's amendments, because he's in Education Committee, and my own amendments. I will try and get it through succinctly. So, Amendment 201, in the name of Ross Greer, specifies that protecting and enhancing the special quality of the area's landscapes is one of the National Park sub-aims. The draft bill removes the term special qualities from the third aim. So this amendment is intended to add balance back into the aims, recognising the importance of landscape and visual impacts. It's an amendment that's backed by APRS, the Scottish Campaign for National Parks, and I think it builds on the Scottish Government's work to recognise and promote special landscapes. Amendment 206 extends the Sanford Principle beyond national park authorities and applies it to other public bodies. So currently under the Sanford Principle, National Park Authority must prioritise nature conservation when it comes into conflict with other subordinate national park aims. So it's an important principle, delivers conservation. The bill, as introduced, imposes a duty on ministers, councils and other public bodies to have regard to the national park aims. So it's a logical extension that when we impose the duty regarding aims, we also extend the prioritisation of those aims that are there within the Sanford Principle. So, for example, it makes no sense for a planning decision to be considered by a park authority and refused on the basis of the Sanford Principle. In other words, prioritising conservation over other interests, but then for ministers, when considering a planning appeal, to not also have regard to nature being the top priority. Amendment 207 requires there to be a public hearing when there is an appeal of a planning application in a national park. And this reflects the special nature of planning decisions in national parks, with hearings acting as an opportunity for ministers and reporters to hear directly from experts. And these could be local residents who are experts in the national park themselves, and also subject-specific experts who will be able to advise on the potential impacts of development proposals. Amendment 208 requires National Park Board members to have public-facing contact information. Now, this is a very small step, but it really would, I think, improve transparency and trust in the national park. It is odd that Loch Lomond, the Trossachs National Park, is the only planning authority anywhere in the UK where members, including directly elected members, are not directly contactable by those that they represent. So, as a matter of good governance, it should be possible for people to contact board members directly without authority staff acting as a filter. And there may even be issues, where that are directly related to those staff, where a resident perhaps needs to get in touch directly with board members to raise a concern. I live in Loch Lomond, Trossachs National Park. It seems odd that a couple of years ago I was asked to vote on my directly elected board member for the local area, but I don't really have their contact details available if I wanted to make a representation to them. Amendments 212 and 213 imposes a multiplier regime for fixed penalty notices issued for bylaw violations in national parks, reflecting that repeated offences ought to carry increased penalties. So this is in line with other multiplier fining regimes that we have, for example, low emission zone fines. So that's Mr Greer's amendments. I'll now move to my own. The introduction of the new duty in Section 5 relating to national park aims is welcome. However, the form of words proposed is have regard to. Amendment 62 strengthens the duty on ministers, park authorities and public bodies to actively further national park aims, which I think is a more action-focused form of words. It would be an active duty on public bodies to take all reasonable steps to further those national park aims. And this underlines the importance of avoiding harm to the statutory aims of the national parks, but also, for example, to seek to further the conservation and enhancement of natural and cultural heritage of an area. Stronger duty could help achieve better progress in delivering on the aims and help deliver on new statutory biodiversity targets. Now, national parks have a major role to play in addressing climate and nature crises. It's been suggested by stakeholders that any area that's proposed as a new national park should demonstrate how that designation will contribute to meeting nature recovery or climate targets. So Amendment 64 does this by adding a new fourth condition for designating a national park area. Amendment 65 specifies that nature and the role of the reporter for a new national park proposal. So the 2000 Act sets this out as being a role for Nature Scot, but ministers should have flexibility to appoint who they believe to be most appropriate. And it might be appropriate to choose a reporter, for example, who is skilled in conducting inquiries and public processes, with Nature Scot taking a slightly different role. You know, they could take a role in terms of feeding in their expertise on the natural environment at an earlier stage when the proposals are actually being drawn up rather than being the reporter themselves. So this would allow Nature Scot to, to promote their expert view on nature conservation, access and landscape, and if appropriate, to support the benefits of a national park in a specific area in the debate with local communities. Nature Scot instead would become a statutory consultee should ministers see fit. So whichever body or individual takes on the reporting role, the Act currently sets out procedures, but very few exceptions as to how a reporter should conduct its work. Reporters should be required to produce its recommendations independently. Its recommendations should be evidence-based and developed for the benefit of the people of Scotland, both current and future generations. Finally, Amendment 27 requires ministers to review the potential of expanding the boundaries of the two existing national parks. So, for example, current boundaries of Loch Lomond and the Trossachs arguably don't really follow the natural geography of the surrounding areas and landscapes. Loch Tay and Loch Earn are bisected by park boundaries that follow old council lines. National Scenic Area landscape protections around Strathearn sit outside the park, and the Park Board has no responsibility for planning decisions. And it seems odd that towns like Comrie and Kenmore are not gateways to the Loch Lomond Trossachs Park from the east. So a boundary review would be an opportunity to build on the success of our two existing national parks and to see if there are opportunities to expand them going forward. And I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you. Can I ask you to move the amendment 201 in the name of Ross Greer?
That's moved.
Thank you. I now call Sarah Boyack to speak to Amendment 122 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I think Part 3 of the bill is a welcome opportunity for us to update Scotland's national parks so they can better respond to our nature and climate crisis. The timing is really good. When I reflect back now, this was one of the first pieces of legislation our Parliament supported in 2000. So I'm very personally engaged in making sure that we learn lessons over the last 25 years since that legislation was introduced and then subsequently our parks created. I've got 9 amendments in this group. I do want to thank a number of groups, Scottish Environment Link, Scottish Land and Estates and the Rewilding Alliance for helping me craft my amendments. I do think there needs to be clearer criteria and greater transparency to ensure that national parks can deliver on their purpose, and also clearer, more accountable processes for creating new parks, supported by defined criteria, with an improved national policy framework and independent expert reporting. So my amendments aim to expand the statutory aims to include promoting sustainable development, affordable housing and employment, and ensuring that national parks contribute to community prosperity. At the same time, my amendments tighten the obligations on public authorities by replacing weaker duties such as have regard to and facilitate implementation with stronger requirements, seeking to further and actively implement national park objectives. And I note in his opening remarks, Mark Ruskell has suggested actively further. So it will be up to members of the committee.
Would Sarah Boyd give way?
Yes, of course.
Thank the member for giving way. Just like to say, we will be supporting your amendments. Would you agree that had these aims been on the face of the original bill, that the issues that were highlighted in the designation of a potential new national park in Galloway, which raised concerns about housing and employment, whatever might have been addressed?
Well, I think that's my point about lessons to be learned, because when we did establish the first national parks, making sure that people could afford to live in those areas was absolutely critical. And as a former planner in Central Region, I knew the issue about the cost of housing for people. So it's really important that we've got a joined-up approach. I think the issues about have regard to and facilitate implementation, these issues come up on a regular basis when legislation is being discussed. So finding a better and stronger way to frame them, I think, is actually quite important. So I'm glad that we've got options in front of you to look at that. I think my Amendment 122 is to pick up the convener's point. It broadens National Park Authority's responsibilities to include sustainable development, so joined-up thinking, so we're not just doing one thing without thinking about the wider issues, affordable housing and employment, and ensuring that local communities benefit alongside visitors. Now, national parks are wonderful places for people to come to visit, but we've also got to think about the communities who live there as well and make sure their lives are going to be successful. So Amendment 123 would shift the focus from individual prosperity to community prosperity, aligning park aims with collective social and environmental goals. And Amendment 124 would strengthen the duty on public bodies by requiring them to seek to further national park aims rather than having simply regard to, which I've mentioned earlier. Now, I note the Cabinet Secretary's got an alternative amendment, number 61. So I think that's good that we're broadly in the same place. So I'm going to listen to the Cabinet Secretary, because I really think it's vital that the community prosperities issue is actually formally included in this legislation, because communities need to be listened to and respected and acted upon. And I think accountability is crucial in that respect. So my Amendment 126 proposes inserting a new subsection to add safeguards or accountability in designating parks. And that, I think, picks up the points made by the convener there. Lessons need to be learned. My Amendment 127 includes a clear definition of cultural development, ensuring that arts, heritage, the Gaelic language and creative industries are considered in park planning. And I think that's important as well, because we think about national parks in terms of nature and beautiful landscapes, but we also need to think about cultural heritage and history, and these things are important as well. Amendment 128 would require ministers to publish a national parks policy statement every 10 years with consultation and parliamentary approval, improving transparency and long-term planning. I want to thank all those organisations that have written in to support this amendment. There is a huge appetite, I think, for making our national parks, pushing them up the agenda, recognising the work that's been done, but also enabling more transparency and long-term planning and support for the work that's being done. Now, I note that Tim Eagle also has an amendment. So I'd prefer mine because I think it's stronger. But again, that's up to the committee to decide. Amendment 129 removes vague wording and requires craft designation orders with full documentation, strengthening clarity and public confidence in new park proposals. So I think, yes, lessons to be learned and thinking about how we build support for our existing and new national parks. Finally, Amendments 125 and 130 strengthen obligations on public bodies to actively implement national park plans rather than just facilitating them. I've mentioned the principles behind this. These amendments introduce safeguards as well by inserting new subsections to limit ministerial discretion, and they provide a clear statutory definition of cultural development to encompass arts, heritage, creativity, the Gaelic language, the creative industries, again giving us that consistency in policy making. And I would argue that taken together, my proposed amendments would embed sustainability, community benefits, cultural recognition and accountability at the heart of Scotland's national parks, creating a more robust, transparent and socially grounded framework for their future management, future designations and really learning lessons but looking to the future as well to see what we can do in Scotland that takes us beyond where we are at the moment. Thank you, Convener. I move amendment. Do I have to do this now, do I? No. Or do I do it later?
I'll ask you later.
I can do it later.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. I now call on Tim Eagle to speak to Amendment 314 and other amendments in the group.
Well, I've now got to try and argue that mine is stronger, but we'll see how we get on. Part 3 of the bill outlines the aims of national parks. My Amendment 314 and my Amendments 202, 203, 204 seek to add further aims to those of national parks, focusing on strengthening the local economy. For me, the changes fail to take the opportunity to deal with issues that really are affecting rural Scotland, such as housing and the local economy. And there seems to be a focus on priorities such as tourism and visitor access over issues like local farming businesses, to the detriment of the rural economy and the natural environment. Food production and farming are, for me, core to Scotland's rural economy. They are also key drivers of the local community and landscape management. My Amendments 314, along with 202, 3 and 4, seek to address some of these issues by seeking to strengthen the local economy. I'd be very happy, though, to work with the Cabinet Secretary on these amendments prior to Stage 3 to get that point further across. My Amendment 315 works alongside my Amendments 317, 318, 319 and 201, which together effectively remove all of Part 3. Now, Part 3 makes various amendments to the National Parks Scotland Act 2000. Stakeholders themselves, though, have said that Part 3 does very little. The new Section 1 introduces some new language that, at best for me, is clarifying. The so-called reform of the National Parks aims also make very limited change, and I've already mentioned key local concerns around housing and the local economy. But importantly for me, the Government has not taken the opportunity to establish a review of the existing national parks. These parks have been in existence for some time, and it's fair to say that many have raised concerns. A review would allow a full understanding of how parks have performed, what value to taxpayer they bring, and how we can ensure they work for the people who live within them and the country. With that in mind, I can't support making changes to national parks without that full picture of how they have been working. My Amendment 316 seeks to add a new section to the bill after Section 5 to require a policy statement on national parks. My amendment will require Scottish ministers to publish and review at least every 10 years a Scottish National Parks policy statement to be approved by the Scottish Parliament. The policy statement should set out broad policy direction for national parks, including a vision and the outcomes sought. The framework ensures transparency and requires consideration of local support and public engagement. My Amendments 209 and 211 seek to reverse the change to the bill makes to the relationship between national parks and how they are to interact with the National Parks Plan. As currently drafted, the national parks are required to have regard to the plan via the National Parks Scotland Act 2000 and 2000. My amendment seeks to maintain proportionality and flexibility in public bodies' obligations by requiring them to have regard to rather than facilitate national park plans. I will seek to ensure evidence-based policy development through an independent review of existing national parks before any new designations, which will be established via my Amendment 214. And finally, my Amendment 214 seeks to add, as I've already spoken about, a section to require a review of national parks. It will require that a review of the effectiveness of existing national parks have been carried out before making any designation for the creation of any new national parks. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr Eagle. I now call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 61 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks very much, Convener. There are a number of amendments in this group, so I will try to work through them as best I can. Just to start with Ross Greer's Amendment 201. Now, while I understand the rationale for this amendment, I believe that this is already covered by the first aim of conserving and enhancing the area's natural and cultural heritage. That there is also an issue with the use of the term landscape because it's a subjective concept and it's not defined. It doesn't have a legal legal definition in Scotland. So I think if we introduce an undefined term into the national park aims, that could lead to uncertainty for decision makers within the parks. So for these reasons, I can't support that amendment. Now, Tim Eagle's amendments 202, 203, 204 and 314 relate to the promotion of employment, job creation, business development, sustainable development, the availability of affordable housing and strengthening the economy in our national parks. And I know that Sarah Boyack's amendment 122 also relates to similar areas. Of course, these are really important elements of ensuring that we have thriving communities within our national parks. I do think that they are already encapsulated in the fourth aim of promoting sustainable economic, social and cultural development at the area's communities, but I do understand why both Tim Eagle and Sarah Boyack have sought to modify the new subsection which elaborates on those aims. So if Sarah Boyack and Tim Eagle are content not to press their amendments today, I'd be happy to work with them both ahead of stage 3. Moving on to Amendment 61 in my name and Amendment 123 in Sarah Boyack's name, they are very similar in nature and relate to the final provision in the new subsection that elaborates on the aims. Now, I have listened to the views of stakeholders who had questioned the way in which this provision had been drafted, and I think particularly the reference that there was to prosperity of individuals. So my amendment clarifies that the policy intention is to promote people's health and well-being and community prosperity. So I think given that the wording in my amendment ensures that the health and well-being of individuals is still included in the aim and has been drafted in keeping with the language used throughout the bill, I would ask the committee to support my Amendment 61 and would ask Sarah Boyack not to press Amendment 123. My Amendment 63 is a minor consequential amendment, and the purpose of that is to provide consistency between paragraph 3 of Schedule 3 of the National Parks Scotland Act and amend section 5.2 of the Act, and I would hope that members could support it. Moving on to Tim Eagle's amendments 315, 317, 318, 319 and 320. Again, as he's outlined, these would collectively seek to remove Part 3 from the bill, so I would ask members not to support those amendments. Turning now to Amendments 62 and 124. Now, through the new duty in Section 5 of the bill, public bodies must have regard to the national park aims when exercising functions which affect a national park. However, it is recognised that public bodies would need to balance these aims against other statutory duties and considerations that they might have. Now, we consulted widely on the have regard to duty, and respondents to the consultation were supportive of the proposal that we put forward. And my concern would be if they were to strengthen the duty so that public bodies operating national park areas are required to seek to further or actively further national park aims, there's a risk that it could affect how public bodies balance consideration of the national park aims with other statutory duties and considerations they might have. And I think it could potentially then open the bodies up to legal challenge when trying to fulfil their own statutory responsibilities. So for these reasons, I can't support the amendments and would also ask members not to support them. Yes.
Could you give us an example of the kind of problem you think it might actually create? Because we're looking for joined-up thinking here, aren't we, that supports communities and individuals and our fantastic natural environments, and joined-up thinking.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with that. I'd have to follow up with a specific example of what that could look like. But again, we've tried to strike that right balance, and what we've put forward in the wording that we've proposed is based on consultation, which generally received a lot of support. And I think we just want to ensure that there is no potential for legal risk further down the line. Now, turning to Amendment 206, yes.
Briefly, I'm thinking about the primacy here of the National Park Plan, and surely if there are public bodies that are engaging in the National Park Plan, then surely they are actively furthering that park plan through their actions operating within a park, supporting those park aims. Further to Sarah Boyack's point, I'm just trying to imagine a situation where a public body would absolutely be working in the opposite direction of a National Park Plan. Surely that would be concerning. They could have regard to that park plan, but there's no actual commitment for them to actually work with that park plan, of which they would have been part of, inputting their views into that.
Again, I think there could, though, potentially be that conflict in the future. Now, I absolutely agree with what you're saying in terms of how public bodies interact with the park and the park plans. I think that there is obviously close engagement as the park plans are developed as well. But again, for us, it's about striking that balance and trying to minimise any risk there could be in the future, which is why we've selected the wording that we have there. Now, Ross Greer's Amendment 206 would require public bodies to give greater weight to the first national park aim when having regard to the aims in circumstances where it appears the aims are in conflict with one another. Again, with this amendment, there's a risk that the primary duties and functions of public bodies could be qualified or imbalanced when trying to fulfil their own statutory responsibilities. So for these reasons, I don't support this amendment and would ask members not to support it either. Turning to Tim Eagle's amendments 209 and 211, these would reverse the changes proposed by the bill as drafted, while Sarah Boyack's amendments 125 and 130 would change the duty from facilitate the implementation of national park plans to actively implement the plans. Now, I think that the policy intention of what Sarah Boyack's amendments is trying to do are perhaps similar to the policy intention that we have with the bill. However, again, the language used in the bill, I think, provides a balance between the requirement to implement actions within national park plans and other duties and considerations that public bodies might have. So taking all of that into consideration, I would ask Tim Eagle not to press his amendments 209 and 211 and Sarah Boyack not to press amendments 125 and 130. Turning now to Mark Ruskell's amendments 64 and 65. Amendment 64, I think it's important to note that climate change and nature conservation duties already apply to national park authorities. Additionally, one of the existing conditions for designating a new national park is that it would meet the special needs of the area and would be the best means of ensuring that the national park aims are collectively achieved. And through the amendments to the aims in the bill, biodiversity and climate change are two elements which should be considered towards achieving the aims. So it seems likely, therefore, that any area which might be considered for future designation would also need to consider nature restoration and climate action. So I don't think it's necessary to introduce a separate condition which focuses on the area's potential contribution to nature recovery targets, and would ask the committee not to support that amendment. On Amendment 65 and the choice of reporter, I have carefully considered this amendment, particularly in light of the recent experience in Galway and Ayrshire, where Nature Scot was appointed to consider the national park proposal, consult on it and prepare a report for ministers. I appreciate the concerns were raised during the consultation and reporting process, and I do think it's important that we learn lessons from that experience. Now, I recognise that ministers might wish to have the flexibility to appoint someone other than a public body as a reporter, if they consider that to be the most appropriate course of action in certain circumstances. So I would therefore ask Mark Ruskell not to press his amendment today, to allow us to have further discussions and to work on that ahead of stage 3. Now, turning to Ross Greer's Amendment 207, which seeks to make it a statutory requirement to hold a public hearing for any appeal against a planning decision made by a National Park Authority, I think this amendment would undermine the established principle of taking a proportionate approach to the appeals process. Currently, it's for the reporter to determine the most appropriate approach to obtaining the evidence they need to determine the appeal. And the amendment would mean that a hearing would be required for all appeals, even for very minor changes of use and smaller scale proposals, which may have limited bearing on the aims of the national park. And ultimately, that would increase the timescale and the costs involved with the planning appeal process for all parties involved. And it would also cut across planning appeals regulations, which apply across the country. So for these reasons, I'm not able to support the amendment, and I would also ask the committee not to support it. Amendment 208 relates to the public accountability of national park authorities to ensure that each member provides public-facing contact information. Now, I would like to assure members that both of our national park authorities take public accountability and transparency extremely seriously. The names, roles and register of interest for each board member is publicly available on the park authorities' websites, along with a phone number and central email address for board members. Now, when correspondence is received in the central mailboxes, it's then transferred by the authorities' governance teams to the relevant board member. Now, not only is this an efficient way of dealing with correspondence, it also reduces cyber security risks. Ross Greer's amendment would suggest the need for the National Park authorities to set up and regularly monitor individual email accounts for each board member. So that would be 17 accounts in Loch Lomond and Trossachs and 19 in Cairngorms, which I believe would be unwieldy and an inefficient use of public resources. And for those reasons, I would hope that Mark Russell will not press the amendment on behalf of Ross Greer, and I would ask members not to support it if it is pressed. Yes.
It seems a bit strange that there wouldn't be, and I understand there is kind of security issues as well, but at least an email address where board members could pick up their own emails without a standard board park email address for board members, so they could pick up their own correspondence.
I mean, again, all that would add is, I think, more pressure on how the situation is handled currently, because they would still potentially be centrally monitored, which just means whoever is monitoring that has to monitor as I say, 17 different accounts in Loch Lomond and Trossachs and pass that on to members as opposed to just monitoring one account. Again, I just think it would be unwieldy and inefficient use of resources.
Again, sorry.
Yes.
No, I'm not suggesting that that become an official park email address. It becomes an individual email address, like all of us in the Parliament have our own email addresses. It's not for the Parliament to check whether we're reading, responding. That would be down to the individual whose email address it was.
But again, that's not something that I've heard from the boards themselves as something that they would be seeking to have. Or again, I believe that they're broadly content with how this is managed at the moment, and they could still consider to handle that in the same way, which again I believe would just be unwieldy. And again, can only reiterate the points that I've made in relation to that. In relation to Amendments 126 and 127 from Sarah Boyack, they seek to insert a definition of cultural development in the 2000 Act. It is important that if a definition of cultural heritage is to be included, that we get the drafting right on that, just to ensure that we're avoiding any unintended consequences. So I would just like a little bit more time to consider that. But to be clear, I do agree with what Sarah Boyack is trying to do here. So I'd be happy to work with Sarah Boyack ahead of Stage 3 on that definition that provides a clear and so that it's clear and comprehensive, and would ask her not to press an amendment today to allow that conversation to take place. And now turning to Amendments 128 and 316, which both seek a National Parks policy statement. Now, reflecting on the recent process, again, that we've been through in looking at a new national park, I appreciate that some people said they would have found it helpful to have a clearer understanding of the Scottish Government's vision for national parks and the role they play. I do have concerns about the resource implications of Sarah Boyack's amendment and can't support it on that basis, but I am happy to support Tim Eagle's Amendment 316. On Amendment 129, from Sarah Boyack, I understand the rationale for this amendment. Again, during the consultation process that we've recently been through and the designation of a new park, some parties said they would have liked greater clarity on what national park designation would mean in practice. But a major concern that I have with this amendment as it's drafted is that a blueprint for a new national park, including the boundary, functions and governance structure, would have to be presented without the benefit of consultation and that co-design with local communities and with stakeholders too. And I think many people would be likely to criticise the Scottish Government for imposing what would then be considered its view of a national park on their area without proper consultation first. However, I would be willing to work with Sarah Boyack ahead of Stage 3 if she's willing not to press an amendment today to discuss a possible alternative, such as a requirement for ministers to seek expert advice on the rationale for designating a national park in an area before a formal proposal is made by ministers. So I hope Sarah Boyack's content not to press on that basis, again, to allow time for that conversation to take place. Now, Amendment 66 modifies the fixed penalty notice provisions in the bill to include the ability to confer powers to enter land for or in connection with the issuing of fixed penalty notices, and I would ask that the committee supports this amendment. And Ross Greer's Amendments 212, 213 also seek to modify the fixed penalty notice provisions. Now, I do have sympathy for the rationale behind what Ross Greer is trying to do with these amendments. However, I don't think the provision that's made by them is necessary, because Section 26A of the bill already provides for the amount of fixed penalty to be discounted or increased by an amount or percentage in circumstances specified by the regulations. And in terms of repeat offenders, I think I would also agree that they should be dealt with more severely. But in some cases, a report to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service would be, excuse me, Convener, the most appropriate next step. It's also worth noting that ministers will be required to consult stakeholders and interested parties before making the regulations that set out the detailed regime. So for these reasons, I would hope that Mark Ruskell on behalf of Ross Greer would not press these amendments today. And then turning to Amendments 27 and 214 from Mark Ruskell and Tim Eagle, I appreciate that some members have called for a review of national parks following the recent process in Galloway and Ayrshire and have therefore given these amendments very careful consideration. Now, on Mark Ruskell's Amendment 27, this would place a duty on ministers to prepare a report on the benefits of expanding the existing national parks. Again, this isn't something that I've had raised with me and it hasn't been put forward for ministers to consider. A report of this kind would require significant time and resource from the Scottish Government, the two national park authorities and other public bodies and organisations operating in the area. The preparation of a report within 12 months of the bill achieving royal assent would also be extremely difficult to achieve achieve, given the forthcoming Scottish parliamentary election and the time that would then be required to consult local communities and businesses. Finally, the requirement for the report to assess the potential impact of expanding the boundaries of the existing parks on meeting the biodiversity targets proposed in the bill doesn't seem to be realistic, given that the bill provides a framework for targets and the actual targets aren't known at this stage. So it's for these reasons that I can't support this amendment today. Yes?
Thank you for giving way. I mean, these are not new issues. I mean, the Cabinet Secretary might recall there was much debate about the setting of the boundary of the Cairngorms National Park. In fact, John Swinney had to move a member's bill in order to change that boundary, and that in the recent campaigns and public consultation around the designation of a new national park in Scotland, there was considerable interest and public support and public engagement around a Tay Forest National Park, which would have by default effectively expanded the coverage of national parks in Highland Perthshire. So, the essence of expanding what national parks do in Perthshire has been consulted. There is some considerable public support, and I think there's an appetite for a consideration of this. I'd be interested to hear, if it's not through this amendment and not through putting something into this bill, then how the Cabinet Secretary would see that that public interest continue. And potentially lead, if there's support for it, to a boundary change in the future.
Again, I appreciate what you've set out in relation to that in the genesis of the amendment, but again, I just have to be clear, in terms of the issues that are raised by me in relation to national parks, I think this just hasn't featured, and I think in terms of the overall priorities that are raised with me for national parks as well, I haven't had that call or for us to reconsider the boundaries. And again, not even withstanding that, I think there are significant issues just with timing and resource that are set out in the amendment, which means that I'm not able to support that today. Now, Amendment 214 from Tim Eagle would also require time and resource, which I also believe could impact on the important delivery priorities of our national park authorities. Now, I did make clear when I was responding to the Citizen Participation and Public Petitions Committee, I believe that our national parks are accountable and transparent and that they do deliver on their objectives. There is already oversight of their performance by ministers. Their annual accounts are laid before Parliament, and Parliament also has the ability to scrutinise the performance of our parks if it wishes to do so. So I therefore don't think that an independent review is necessary, and for these reasons I do not support this amendment and ask members not to support it either. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Any other members? No, I call Mark Ruskell to speak on behalf of Ross Greer to wind up, press or withdraw Amendment 201.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. I mean, this is a huge group of amendments and it covers so many different issues. It's very difficult to unpack all of this in a single debate. But I think, Sarah Boyack perhaps summed it up where she said that, we need to learn lessons and look to the future. And there are a number of strands here. There's obviously, the learnings around the recent, designation or lack of designation around the Galloway National Park. There's learnings around the debacle over the Loch Lomond flamingo land application and serious concerns there that the National Park Plan was being undermined. And I think there's a lot of learning from that in terms of, the primacy of that park plan, about the accessibility of park board members. So, that's just one area. And clearly there's a debate around landscape at the moment. There's a debate around the purpose of national parks. I guess what I would say, to the Cabinet Secretary is that, you've made a number of commitments to a number of members to, have further conversations between Stage 2 and Stage 3. And I think, the conversation around the primacy of park plans and ensuring that all public authorities don't dismiss that park plan, but they actually work to further the aims of the park and to further the aspirations and the plan, I think is really important. And I think this committee has had evidence to show that there are public authorities, including FLS, who have actively, in some cases, undermined some of the objectives of park plans. And of course, with Flamingo Land, I think there were learnings there in terms of the role of Scottish enterprise in relation to the promotion of a site for a development which was hugely unpopular and was in contravention of the park plan. So within the nugget of some of these amendments, there is a concern about democracy, there's a concern about the accessibility of park authorities, but there's also a desire to see that democratically agreed park plan is actually delivered and that everybody's pulling in the same direction. And I think if we can take some of the kind of essence of those concerns into conversations with your Cabinet Secretary between stage 2 and stage 3. I hope we can come to a form of words that really reflects the aspirations of the communities. Sorry, yes.
Just to say, I think that's a really important issue because we don't want public bodies cutting across national park plans, and equally we want the national park plans to actually reflect the views of other public bodies as well as the public. So getting this right on the face of the bill, I agree with Mark Ruskell, is absolutely critical, and it will need the engagement of the Cabinet Secretary to make sure we get this right, given the evidence that the committee has looked at over the last few weeks and months, which we just can't ignore.
Yeah,
thank you.
Very well put, and I think it cuts both ways. You know, the park plans need to reflect those wider public objectives that public authorities are working on, but they also need to reflect the views of communities as well, and biodiversity targets that will be set under Part 1 of this bill. So I'm going to leave my comments there, but hope that we can get in some meaningful discussions with yourself, Cabinet Secretary, and that we can come to stage 3 with a tighter grouping of amendments that actually drills down on what we can do now, and perhaps if we can have conversations with you about, you know, post the National Parks designation process, like where we now take the aspirations of communities, where we take those debates going forward. And if it's not in Part 3 of this bill, then where should it be for the next Scottish Government and for local authorities who invested a lot of time and effort into getting the debate going about national parks, but now really have nowhere to go with it, and to the point that it's not in your inbox apparently. So, you know, there's nowhere to take it now, and I think that's a shame, because national parks are working, they are achieving things. But we need to ensure that there's a clear vision for where they go in the future. I'm going to end there. Thank you. And I will move to 201.
Yeah. Press or withdraw Amendment 201 in the name of Ross Greer?
Press.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 201 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those against the amendment? Those wishing to abstain? The result of the vote is 4 for, 5 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 122 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not move.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. I call Amendment 314 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. I call Amendment 61 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 201. And I remind members that if Amendment 61 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 123 due to preemption. Cabinet Secretary, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 61 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those opposed to the amendment? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 7 for, 2 against. The amendment has therefore been agreed. I now call Amendment 202 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 203 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 204 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 205 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, already debated with Amendment 172. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Moved.
So the question is that Amendment 205 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hand now. Those opposed to the amendment? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 62 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 201. And I remind members that Amendment 62 and 124 are direct alternatives. That is, they can both be moved and decided on. The text of whatever is the last agreed to is what will appear in the bill. Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Moved.
So the question is that Amendment 62 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 4 for, 5 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I now call Amendment 124 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Moved.
So the question is that Amendment 124 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members abstaining? And the result of the vote is 4 for, 5 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 206 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 201. Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Moved.
And the question is that Amendment 206 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hand now. Those members wishing to oppose? Those members abstaining? The result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 63 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 201. The Cabinet Secretary, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 63 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 315 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 315 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I now call Amendment 64 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 201.
Moved.
Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Moved.
And the question is that Amendment 64 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 65 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 201. Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has been moved. The question is that Amendment 65 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 4 for, 5 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 207 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 201. Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 207 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Those supporting, well, there will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 3 for, 6 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 208 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 201. Ross Greer, to move or not move? I beg your pardon. Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
It's easy to confuse us, but yes, I will move.
Moved. The question is that Amendment 208 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 316 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move? The question is that Amendment 316 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 7 for, 2 against, no abstentions. The amendment has therefore been agreed. I call Amendment 126 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 127 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 317 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move? Moved. That has not been moved, so will not be considered. The question is that Section 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I now call Amendment 128 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. I call Amendment 129 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not moved to date.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 209 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. And I remind members that if Amendment 209 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 125 due to preemption. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 209 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hand now. Those opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 125 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not moved to date.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 210 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, already debated with Amendment 172. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 210 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No. Yep.
We are not agreed. There will be division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 211 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. And I remind members that if Amendment 211 is agreed to, I cannot call 130 down to preemption. Tim Eagle, to move or not move? That has not been moved, so will not be considered. I call Amendment 130 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 201. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Not moved to date.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendment 318 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That's not been moved, so it will not be considered. The question is that Section 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. I call Amendment 319 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. The question is that Section 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. I call Amendment 66 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 201. The Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 66 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not all agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hand now. Those opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? The result of the vote is 7 for, 2 against. The amendment has therefore been agreed. I call Amendment 212 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 201. Mark Ruskell to move or not move? Moved. The question is that Amendment 212 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hand now. Those opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 1 for, 8 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 213 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 201. Mark Ruskell to move or not move? Moved. The question is that Amendment 213 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting amendment, please raise your hand now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 1 for, 8 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 320 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle to move or not move? That has not been moved, so will not be considered. The question is that Section 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 27 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 201. Mark Ruskell to move or not move? Moved. The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? The result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 214 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 201. Tim Eagle to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. We are just going to suspend for 5 minutes to allow for a changeover of witness. I suspend this meeting. I now call Amendment 67 in the name of Ariane Burgess, group with Amendment 67, 67A, 288, 303 and 334. Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 67 and 67A and speak to all amendments in the group.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. I mean, members will be aware that, we've got so many amazing rewilding nature restoration projects underway across Scotland. Many of those have been funded by the Nature Restoration Fund, and there's often communities and NGOs that are involved in, managing these sites. However, there's no current level of kind of protection for these undesignated sites where considerable amount of time and effort and money has been spent. For example, community-owned woodlands. So if the ownership of those sites were to change hands in the future, there'd be little to prevent a new owner from undoing the restoration that's taken place. So Amendment 67, along with 67A, in the name of Ariane Burgess, requires ministers to review the measures that exist to protect sites where restoration and rewilding is already underway, and for them to consider whether new protection, new designation may be required to ensure that those gains for biodiversity can be retained in the future. 67A makes a small change to wording to clarify that restoration and rewilding are ongoing processes. If I could turn then to Amendment 303 from Ariane Burgess, which picks up on an issue that was included in the government's initial public consultation on this bill. The government had proposed including new measures to increase the proactive management of protected areas. I'll quote here from the bill consultation. It noted that under the current legislative regime, there is no general obligation on land managers to improve or restore features in unfavourable condition or to take action to prevent them from deteriorating to unfavourable condition. I think we can all think of examples within our own regions and constituencies where we see protected areas that are clearly not protected and are continuing to degrade. So, the government at the time reflected on this and proposed a solution to amend the existing land management nature conservation orders to clarify that the provisions are to enforce active management of nature features in protected areas and to tackle issues like invasive non-native species, which we know are absolutely degrading many of these sites. I think this is an issue that really, cuts to the heart of what the bill is trying to achieve. I mean, this is a nature emergency bill, and despite having protected areas, we are seeing this kind of degradation and loss continue. Now, 86% of respondents to the government's own consultation supported those proposals, and I think, we've already heard this morning about, the importance of consultation and going with the grain of that. But, that wasn't included in the bill, despite that public support. So Amendment 303 seeks to add it in. And while I acknowledge that there are some revisions to the wording of this amendment may be required before stage 3, I hope that the Cabinet Secretary can give support to the policy in principle today, given that the government did consult on it, did get that strong stakeholder and public support. And I'll be interested to hear what the Cabinet Secretary says. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Could you move amendments 67 and 67A, please?
I'll move 67 and 67A.
Thank you, Mr Ruskell. And I call Rachel Hamilton to speak to Amendment 288 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 288 requires Scottish ministers to produce a report on moorlands, including what proportion of land in Scotland is moorland, the rate of moorland habitat loss broken down by region, the land uses that are replacing moorlands, and the consequences of moorlands being replaced with other land uses. This amendment was previously lodged in the Land Reform Bill, but fell, and now includes a definition of moorland, because that was the criticism that I had in that specific amendment. This amendment is drawn from a study produced by the Heather Trust, which I hope the Minister has able to have looked at, and it found that overall that Heather Moorland is the same size as Birmingham, is lost every year in the UK, and the research shows that nearly 6,700 kilometres square of moorland in Scotland was lost between 1990 and 2023, in comparison to just over 600 kilometres square during the same period in England, which I believe is, quite a stark comparison. In It also highlights that moorland is being replaced by grassland and woodland, particularly woodland in Scotland, or tree planting, whatever you want to describe it as, and that there is likely to be an additional pressure on moorland habitats from further expansion of woodland in the future. Crucially, the report found that there is a lack of limitation of data in terms of what is replacing moorland, which is what this amendment is all about. Amendment 334 amends the Nature Conservation Scotland Act 2004 to prohibit energy developments in sites of SSI, special scientific interest. Nature Scot says that SSIs are, I quote, those areas of land and water that we consider best represent our natural heritage, close quote, and include flora, fauna, geology, geomorphology, and there are over 1,422 SSIs covering around 1 million hectares of land in Scotland. Rural areas like my constituency, the Scottish Borders, are facing the brunt of energy developments, including battery energy storage systems, wind farms, most recently proposals for 75 kilometres of mega pylons. And these proposals can be very huge, and including some that would see developments as big as villages or even towns. Their impact is equally as large, as they risk harming the Borders countryside and other areas of Scotland, and natural habitats potentially being lost for good. Local communities already understand these risks and have been working hard to highlight them to government ministers, planning officials and energy companies. Groups like Action Against Pylons in the Borders, which is formed of 9 local community action groups, have done brilliant work to highlight the impact that the pylons proposals would have on the environment, including concerns of landscape integrity, wildlife disturbance and a cumulative impact of energy developments. But sadly, the groups and residents in the Borders feel like their concerns are being ignored by the Scottish Government, and this amendment ensures that Scotland's much-loved natural heritage remains protected against the out-of-control energy development proposals in the Borders and across Scotland. I just want to make a couple of comments around Ariane Burgess's amendments. I'm not clear on 67 of what the definition of rewilding is, and land is managed for more purposes than just rewilding, and I believe that if it was designated as rewilding, that would preclude a multi-purpose management of the land. In 303, I am sympathetic to this amendment because I think it's important that we do tackle non-native species. However, I just believe that allowing SNH to have access to the land would be fraught with operational challenges and difficulties, and it might erode the collaboration approach to land management, which in the past, where I have been involved in this committee in land use legislation, that has been a huge concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hamilton. Any other members? Oh, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you and good morning. Amendments 67 and 67A in the name of Ariane Burgess, it's not entirely clear to me what Ms Burgess is seeking to achieve through these amendments. The scope of the review being proposed is very unclear. There's no agreed or statutory definition of nature restoration or rewilding, which makes it difficult to understand how such a review would align with our existing suite of protected areas legislation. And in addition, there's a wide range of land types and activities that could fall under scope of any such review, as there are no limits set out in the amendment on the extent of areas being restored or rewilded to improve biodiversity. This could potentially capture everything from creating a native wildlife area in an urban garden through to landscape-scale nature restoration projects such as Cairngorms Connect. And I'm not certain that a review such as this would necessarily help us improve or drive forward our biodiversity ambitions. I think it's better to focus on delivering for nature restoration and taking forward the action that we know is going to achieve the outcomes we need. A plethora of additional reviews, reports, additional labour-intensive requirements of this type will stretch capacity that we want to use for targeted action. Reviews, of course, do have their place in some circumstances, but we need to ensure that they're targeted and focused and needed. Otherwise, they risk diverting our resources from taking action that is actually helping us to tackle the nature crisis and indeed reduce biodiversity loss. So, for these reasons, I encourage members not to support Amendments 67 and 67A. Turning now to the amendment from Rachel Hamilton, I'm aware that, and she has mentioned herself, that it's similar to an amendment that she lodged during stage 3 of the Land Reform Bill last month, an amendment which Parliament didn't support. And I have no doubt all committee members appreciate, as I do, the importance of moorlands habitats. However, I agree with the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands on what she said at that point in stage 3 of that bill, when she spoke to the amendment during and said it's not helpful for moorlands to be considered in isolation from other ecosystems. It's clear to me that the restoration and regeneration of Scotland's ecosystems, including but not limited to moorland, is at the heart of the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, given that it's one of the 6 key objectives within it, with a number of actions targeted at ensuring the management of moorland helps sustain healthy biodiversity. So I don't believe this amendment is necessary. Again, it calls for another review. I would again question whether resources should be diverted for this purpose, and instead that we should be focusing on strategic actions for all ecosystems that will help secure the biggest biodiversity benefits and help us tackle the nature crisis. I will.
I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. I mean, I tried to work sort of in a way that would, I'm not going to say please the government, but to attract the government to this amendment, because it was noted that, as I said in my opening remarks, that there was no definition of moorland. I mean, moorland is, as a land mass, is a hugely significant in Scotland, and at the moment, I'm being told by people who don't own land, who live in villages that enjoy moorland, that there is no management of moorland. And the government own lots of this moorland. It is specific and it is unique. I mean, Gillian Martin, the minister, will know, because she'll be have enjoyed walking over moorland. But it is specific, and this definition sets out why that moorland habitat should have a specific strategy. I think the government could benefit from this amendment in a way, because it is allowing the government to set out their intention for this huge landmass that is so important to the environmental benefit in Scotland.
Yeah, I don't see the rationale for singling out a particular type of land as opposed to other types of land, given that it's already included in the biodiversity strategy. And for a policy perspective, I don't think there's a clear rationale for undertaking a review that solely concentrates on moorland. And I come back to what I said in relation to Ariane Burgess's amendments and many other amendments that are asking for reviews and reports. The resources associated with that are taking away from action. They're taking the resources away from action as well. And Rachel Hamilton says that she's often, she wants to help the government. I would suggest that we could have had a conversation about this before stage 2, instead of having it played out here. And I could have explained all my rationale for this, and we could maybe have saved us both from this, because I think the rationale, and I'm very, very seized as somebody who has to make sure that all our government bodies under my remit and those that are having to manage their resources and capacity to do things aren't overstretched by onerous reports and reviews been added to the remit when it takes away from the action that we all want them to take. It's getting to the point where there's so many pieces of legislation that insert reviews and reports that it is genuinely an encumbrance, and I question on many occasions whether it actually adds to the action that we all want to see. So for those reasons, I would encourage members not to support Amendment 288. Turning to Ariane Burgess's Amendment 303, while I recognise that effective management of protected areas is absolutely essential in tackling the biodiversity crisis, I'm not persuaded that nature conservations and land management orders are the best way to tackle long-term deterioration of sites caused by under- or overgrazing or the spread of invasive non-native species. And I'm conscious of the complexity of the current legal framework that govern protected areas and nature conservation in general. I would be wary of adding additional complexity and the considerable risk of unintended consequences that this could bring. For example, Amendment 303 inserts a definition of damage into Section 23 of the 2004 Act, which deals with nature conservation orders. But it's unclear what is the purpose of this definition, since damage is not otherwise reflected in Section 23 of the Act. And the purpose of nature conservation orders is to prohibit operations on land to ensure the conservation of any natural feature of the land which ministers consider to be of special interest. So changing that purpose so the orders would be able to require active management of the land. It's not what those orders were intended to do, not what they were designed to do. Turning to land management orders, these can be applied to land which forms part of an SSI or is contiguous to that land. And these orders are already able to set out operations that should be carried out on the land for purposes of conserving, restoring or otherwise enhancing the natural features of the land. So I think that the amendment's actually unnecessary because there's already provision. Land management orders can already be made to tackle issues such as under or overgrazing or invasive non-native species. So for these reasons, I would encourage members not to support Amendment 303. Amendment 334, in the name of Rachel Hamilton, seeks to amend the Nature Conservation Scotland Act 2004 by inserting a new section 11A, which would create an absolute prohibition on energy developments within sites of special scientific interest. Now, the amendment appears to have the intention of providing enhanced protection for SSIs by preventing any energy infrastructure, including renewable energy installations, from being constructed in their boundaries, but it isn't legally competent and therefore wouldn't achieve its express purposes. The generation, transmission, distribution and supply of electricity are reserved matters to the UK Government under the Scotland Act 1998. Scotland Act 1998 is the very foundation of this Parliament, and I would expect that everyone has a working knowledge of it. And I will take an intervention from Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for taking an intervention. And before we go any further, I'd just like to make a brief declaration that I am a partner in a farm in Murray. I'll give a more full declaration when it comes to the deer management section. I'm interested in the Cabinet Secretary's point, and of course the Cabinet Secretary well knows that while matters are reserved, the Scottish Government does actually control the development of power distribution, because they hold the levers of planning in Scotland. Now, the Cabinet Secretary said she's not prepared in the previous thing to separate out individual items because you can't see the rationale for it. Well, SSIs are the underpinning of the legislation that protect Ramsar, SPAs and SCA sites. So it is fundamental to Scotland, and Scotland does have the control of it. The problem is, of course, is that if we continue to develop against SSIs, which are frighteningly small in Scotland, we are probably going to affect birds and other nature matters in these critical areas. So I'm unclear in my mind, Cabinet Secretary, why you are not prepared to give them greater protection, because they underpin everything that this government does and can do in Scotland when it comes to nature conservation. Perhaps you could explain that to me.
So I want to separate out the desire to give greater protection to SSI sites. That's fundamentally, I agree that they should be protected. It's untrue to say that a Scottish Government minister has the ability to control what happens in energy developments because they have the final consent, and because the regulations associated with and the consenting powers under sections 36 and 37 of the Electricity Act 1989 are by executive devolution, indeed to the final consent. They do not, you've asked for an explanation, I would like to give a full explanation. Therefore, the regulations are set at UK level and must be acted under in terms of that consent. Now, Rachel Hamilton's amendment fundamentally wants to change what is in reserved law. That means it is not legislatively competent. And this happened in previous amendments from Douglas Lumsden, where I was able to set out the same argument. Now, if Conservative members want me to have the powers associated with energy infrastructure, there is a simple answer to that. You devolve the powers to the Scottish Parliament and Government. They are not devolved, therefore I cannot act in that way. To do so would be an infringement and would not be legally competent. So the amendment, as it... Yes, I will.
Sorry, thank you. Just very briefly, I'm very always happy to come to a committee and be patronised about my knowledge of the Electricity Act, which I know in quite great detail, having been a surveyor and having worked for SSE on power lines across Scotland. But what I won't take from you, Cabinet Secretary, is the fact that you don't have control. If you're saying it is incompetent, then it is incompetent for you in Scotland to say that you won't accept nuclear power, because it's a totally reserved matter. You are doing it because you have control of the planning levers to stop it. You cannot argue one thing one way and then one thing another way. Could you explain how it's possible to pick and choose as you're doing?
I have to say that I have taken legal advice on every single one of the amendments that have been put to me. And this amendment is simply not legally competent. Now, we can get into a big debate about energy and energy infrastructure, and I know that people are wanting to do that in the wider space of the Parliament. I am talking to this amendment, which is not legally competent. So, therefore, I would... yes, I will, and then I'm going to conclude.
I appreciate that. Would the Cabinet Secretary work with me to make it competent?
It can be made competent, Ms Hamilton, because it effectively is asking the Scottish Government to prohibit something that has already got reserved powers around, regulation around, environmental assessment requirements around, which are robust and probably some of the strongest in the whole of the UK. Now, obviously, we can talk about whether they are robust enough. We can talk about whether or not we have all the levers that Ms Hamilton would want me to use. But as it stands, I cannot see how this could be made legally competent. By all means, if you want to come and see me about any of your amendments, my door is always open and was open before stage 2. And I will close there because I think that I've been accused of patronising people. I'm simply stating facts around the separation of powers. So for these reasons, I would encourage members not to support Amendment 334, and I'll finish there, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I call on Matt Ruskell to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 67A in the name of Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. I'll be brief. I'm reflecting a bit on what the Cabinet Secretary was saying there about, the need to move from reviews into action and delivery. But I do think that is the essence of Ariane Burgess's Amendment 303. It's about saying that the existing system of land management orders is not delivering the action that we need to restore nature. And, when people look around their communities, they can see SSIs degrading in plain sight. It's clear that the system isn't working. So I recognise, there was an invitation to discuss this ahead of stage 2 and an ongoing invitation. So I think myself and Ariane Burgess will take that up with you and will want to explore with you the provisions that were brought forward by the government in the initial consultation, whether there is something there within this bill or outside of this bill that we could take forward to improve that, because delivery isn't happening. In terms of 67, 67A, I won't move these today, but clearly these are concerns that Ariane Burgess is hearing from communities themselves, so it would be good to relay that to you directly. In terms of the other amendments, I think it's not entirely clear what Rachel Hamilton is trying to achieve here, because she talks about tree planting and woodland, so I'm not sure if that's commercial trees or if that's woodland restoration.
Would Mark Ruskell take an intervention?
If I could just explain, just continue the point here, because in discussions with estate owners who I know who are developing land management plans at the moment, I know there's not a hard line between moorland and woodland, and actually the best place to really talk about the future of planning of an estate and where the balance of conservation, different habitats lies, is within a land management plan. And we did agree provisions on land management plans in the Land Reform Bill. It didn't go quite as far as I would have liked it to. But I think actually now I'm quite hopeful that Moreland will have its voice within those land management plans, and local communities who've got an interest and a love of moorlands will be able to influence that in terms of the importance of the future of that landscape going forward. So I do take the essence of what she's trying to achieve here, but I think we kind of got to where we got to at the end of the Land Reform Bill, and I'd like to see that roll out. In terms of energy infrastructure, I mean, I know there's a campaign here. But I do think, going back to our discussions about Part 2 last week, I do think that our system of environmental assessment is working, it is robust, and I do see communities using the concerns that are being raised by ecologists in environmental assessments to build the case for consideration for refusal of renewable energy development, or to assuage concerns, or to focus concerns on areas where there may well be impact, and to enter into discussions pre-application with developers around siting of turbines in other areas. So, like, I do think it offers a window on the potential impact of renewable energy development. And I think if there isn't an impact of renewable energy development, I don't see why it can't go ahead. But that is for the Energy Consents Unit to discuss. And I think the more that communities can engage with the environmental assessment process and to reveal that impact, I think the better. So I don't see the necessity of that amendment. I'll draw my comments to a conclusion, Convener.
Thank you. Can I just confirm, Mr Ruskell, whether you're withdrawing
I'll
amendment
withdraw 67 and 67A, if that's possible.
Thank you. The member has indicated they wish to withdraw the amendment. Does any member object? No. Mark Ruskell, to press or withdraw amendment 67?
Not pressed.
Not pressed. So, any members have any objection? No. So that will not be considered. Given there is not a natural break in the next section for quite some time, I'm minded to have a slightly extended comfort break at the moment. So I'll suspend the meeting until 11:20. We'll now continue with consideration of amendments, and I call Amendment 215 in the name of Tim Eagle, grouped with Amendments 216, 131, 217, 28 and 218. Tim Eagle to move Amendment 215 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Well, thank you, Convener. Can I first of all move Amendment 215? And before I start on my notes, a quick apology. There is quite a lot of detail in this section and the next section around deer management, so I'll try and get through that as quickly as possible. For brevity, I won't spend too long on amendments. Just first of all, though, because of that level of detail, I think, and the work that I've done with stakeholders, regardless of what happens today, I know the Minister's door is normally always open, and I will seek a meeting with the Minister before Stage 3, just to express some of the detail of these points, if that's okay. And the second thing I just wanted to highlight quickly, I was a little bit worried yesterday when I saw the press release in Farming UK around an FOI that had come out just recently from some of the rural stakeholders that said, and I'll quote this, sorry, I've got it just here. This was in June 23. A briefing to ministers stated, to go beyond preventing damage is a significant shift in balance between public and private interests, and we could expect challenges to this proposal on European Convention on Human Rights grounds, with particular reference to A1P1 protection of property. That alarmed me when I saw that yesterday, because obviously we're going to come on, I think my colleague Edward Mountain has various amendments on 6ZB and the new proposals that are in this bill. And I think I'd be worried if officials are saying that there's potential legal challenges, then I think that's something that we need to pick up on, and I hope the Minister might pick up on that on his remarks today. But in terms of my specific amendments, Amendment 215, the bill as currently drafted sets out the aims and purposes of deer management, making changes to the Deer Scotland Act 1996. It currently includes a purpose to promote the sustainable management of deer. My amendment exchanges the word promote for further. That means the aim will read to further the sustainable management of deer. This change, I believe, will strengthen the Scottish Government's role from merely promoting to actively furthering sustainable deer management, which I believe will be critical to the medium to long-term delivery of biodiversity and climate change actions. The bill sets out, in terms of my Amendment 216, the bill sets out the aims and purposes of deer management. This includes to safeguard the public interest insofar as it relates to the management and control of deer. And my Amendment 216 seeks to delete that reason. Now, the decision by Scottish ministers to adopt a broad and highly subjective aim to safeguard the public interest insofar as it relates to the management and control of deer, the part of my amendment relates to is not consistent with the Deer Working Group recommendations. Safeguarding the public interest is not a policy objective in its own right, but the outcome that clear and specific objectives are meant to deliver. The deletion of this clause removes uncertainty from the legislation. I believe that the term public interest has no fixed meaning and it introduces a subjective element into the law. The bill modifies the Deer Scotland Act 1996 in Section 1, which deals with the Deer Commission's general functions. Whilst exercising functions, the Commission is to consider factors such as the size and density of the deer population and its impact on the natural heritage. The bill seeks to add in the size and density of the deer population and its impact on the environment. My Amendment 217 seeks to delete the addition of the environment. I am concerned that the term environment introduces broad, overarching objectives that reflect national rather than local priorities. Section 10(4)A adds the phrase "and environment," and the accompanying explanatory note justifies this on the basis that NatureScot must consider the cumulative impact of deer across Scotland when shaping management policy. Yet NatureScot itself acknowledges that national deer numbers are less important than the local and regional environmental impacts. If, as NatureScot asserts, the cumulative national impact is of limited relevance, then the justification for expanding the statutory language of the 1996 Act to include the environment is weak and open to challenge. Now, with regard to other amendments in the group, I will be supporting my colleague Edward Mountain MSP's amendments and look forward to hearing him from today, and Douglas Ross MP's dear amendments. Now, I'm speaking to Douglas Ross's Amendment 218. So Section 11 of the bill would allow NatureScot to take an active part in proceedings for advisory panels on deer management. Previously, they could only attend panels and act as an observer. This amendment deletes that section entirely. NatureScot have the function of acting as a regulator responsible for enforcing deer management measures, but the ability to also sit on deer management panels raises concerns about a conflict of interest. This section appears to be little short of further overreach of a government quango and another example of where Nature Scotch functions or proposed functions collide. In the interest of preventing such overreach and reducing further conflicting powers, this amendment deletes the extended function from the bill. I cannot support Mark Ruskell's MSP's Amendment 28 because I have concerns over the uncertainty of who could take the powers over dear functions that Mr Ruskell's amendments seeks to transfer. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I now call Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 131 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. And as I alluded to in the last group, I'd make a slightly fuller declaration that I did do last time. I remind members of my register of interest where it says that I own and manage farmland in Murray, approximately 500 acres that I own. And I'd just like to say that I've been involved in deer management for over 50 years. I've written deer management plans for various deer management groups across Scotland, some of which still remain in force, I'm pleased to say. They've stood the test of time. My Amendment 131, Convener, places a duty on ministers to ensure that rural employment associated with deer management is not just protected, but actually promoted on the face of the bill. It's quite clear, Minister, that organisations such as BASC and SLE and SGA have shared with me their concerns about the lack of safeguarding of jobs and livelihoods related to deer management, and that these jobs and livelihoods must never be sacrificed on the government's aim and some people's aim to turbocharge deer reduction. Now, I'm going to talk about that in the next section, but it is quite frightening, Minister, that a lot of jobs are being pushed sideways, full-time jobs, onto contract killers being brought in to kill deer. Now, deer managers and gamekeepers have real concerns about the fact that this bill doesn't recognise the invaluable work that they do. Not only is shooting worth about £760 million to the Scottish economy, but the bill risks undermining the very jobs that we rely on. Minister, you kindly and with skill chaired a meeting of a group as a result of the Darver fires the other day, and the importance of making sure that these fires were controlled. And to me, it was clear that it was a lot of gamekeepers and deer managers that actually stopped the fires spreading beyond where they spread to, and the damage being incurred across a wider area. And in fact, I believe the selfless action of those people prevented the loss of life. It therefore seems only right that we should be protecting those jobs and ensuring that when it comes to deer management, we give them due consideration. Now, I could talk to Tim Eagle's amendment. I'm not going to. I'm interested specifically in Mark Ruskell's Amendment 28. And the reason why I say this is because I want to hear what Mark Ruskell says, Convener, because it would appear that he's shifting deer control out of the control of Nature Scot or Scottish Natural Heritage, whatever we do. Perhaps it's a reversion to the good old days where deer management was done by an organisation called the Deer Commission Scotland, which was actually an organisation, a government organisation. Perhaps the Minister will remember it, but it was a government organisation that drew everyone together, helped set cull targets, and worked extremely well in the field of deer management. It was collaborative, it was wide-ranging, and everyone felt they had a say. There was some stick behind their powers, but it was unfortunately dissolved by the government in 2010 and subsumed within Scottish Natural Heritage, something which I think has been to the detriment of deer management. So if Mark Ruskell's Amendment 28 seeks to bring back the Deer Commission Scotland into a separate organisation, I would be bound to support it, Mr Ruskell, which may obviously be the kiss of death to your amendment. But we'll wait and see, Convener. I have nothing further to add on that matter.
I now call Mark Ruskell to speak to Amendment 28 and other amendments in the group.
Gosh, it's got interesting. Yeah, so Amendment 28 would allow ministers to transfer Nature Scot's deer function to another public body that might be better equipped in the future to discharge those duties. So there are other public bodies that are currently in existence, such as Forest and Land Scotland, which already have very significant engagement with sustainable deer management over a very large part of Scotland. So the intention of this amendment isn't to make a transfer of those duties right now. It's to really future-proof the governance of deer management in Scotland by providing the Minister with that flexibility in the future. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Any other members? No. Minister.
Thank you very much, Convener. I will start off with Tim Eagle's amendments 215, 216 and 217. I'm not sure that I understand why Tim Eagle is seeking to amend the bill in this way. At various points in the Stage 1 debate, Mr Eagle outlined he thought that the powers of Nature Scot that Nature Scot had were broad and too vague. But his amendments don't seem to add any clarity to Nature Scot's aims, purposes and functions under the 1996 Act, but rather they seek to limit the functions of Nature Scot in achieving that sustainable deer management that we're all looking for. And we've seen significant growth and expansion of deer since the late 1950s, and changes need to be made if we are going to make an impact on their populations. So the changes to Nature Scot's aims, purposes and functions under the 1996 Act were recommended by the Deer Working Group. Furthermore, the Committee's own Stage 1 report agreed with these changes to Section 1 of the Act, which adds safeguarding to the public interest, safeguarding the public interest so far as it relates to the management and control of deer, to the statutory aims and purposes of deer management for Nature Scot. So I'm not sure why Mr Eagle is seeking to undermine those positive changes, and for the reasons I've outlined, I will not support Amendments 215, 216 and 217, and I would ask members not to vote for them. I am supportive of the aim of Mr Mountain's Amendment 131 and what it's looking to achieve, but I can't support the amendment today. We've got excellent deer managers up and down the country, and I want to ensure that they know, as I do, that we will always need skilled people on the ground to manage our deer populations. As drafted, it would require Nature Scot to consider protection and promotion of deer management, employment and carrying out any of their deer function. That's impractical for this bill. Through the bill, we have amended the general aims and purposes of Nature Scot under the Deer Act. They'll have a duty to take into account, if appropriate, the public interest as it relates to deer management and carrying out their deer functions. And that would include issues such as impact on employment in rural communities. And I think that's a really important point that has been missed so far, Convener. We're also working out with the bill to provide financial support for deer management, including incentive pilots in the Cairngorms National Park, South Loch Ness and funding for venison larders. Our deer populations are without doubt a fantastic asset to Scotland, and I intend to continue to work with deer managers across the country to consider what better support they might need. It's for these reasons I don't think that this amendment is necessary, and I would ask members not to support it. Regarding the amendment from Mark Ruskell, Amendment 28, I understand the intention to provide flexibility in transferring deer management functions, but I would highlight to members that the current framework already allows Scottish ministers to direct Nature Scot and set priorities without removing its statutory role. I'll take an intervention here.
Thank you, Minister. My point of going back to the days of the DCS is that people who were managing deer felt that they had a specific organisation which could listen to them and heard their views and were related to their views. And a lot of the members of the Deer Commission Scotland were actually stalkers employed by the DCS. The problem is since it's moved into Nature Scot or Scottish Natural Heritage, that experience has gone. And my experience and the experience of many people across deer management in Scotland is that Nature Scot doesn't understand the problem. So on that basis, if he's not prepared to support the amendment, would he at least support the fact that deer management in Nature Scot must be done by people who have taken part in deer management? You know, they must have walked the miles in the boots to be able to tell the boots which direction to go in, Minister. Is that not fair?
I like your analogy, Mr Mountain. However, I'm going to disagree with you. I think that Nature Scot have the functions and the capability to be able to do their job properly, but I think that has to be in conjunction with deer stalkers and managers that are on the ground, which is why I actively encourage Nature Scot to have regular contact with the deer management groups. I think what I'd like to lay out right at the start of this process as we start to talk about deer management, I would really like us to get to the position where we stop having the polarisation of this debate. What we're trying to do is recognise the asset that venison and deer are to Scotland across all the sectors. But that doesn't mean to say there aren't going to be issues that we're going to have to manage as we go along. So I take the point that the member's making. I disagree with it, so I'm not going to accept the amendment that he has put forward. The amendment adds complexity without clear evidence of need. If circumstances require a change in responsibilities, that can be addressed through existing mechanisms where possible or primary legislation, if required, ensuring full parliamentary scrutiny. So we've got all the tools that we need there already. Sorry, that was Mr Ruskell's amendment. I would, of course, be happy to meet with Mr Ruskell to discuss any of the specific concerns that he has, but for the reasons I've set out, I would ask Mr Ruskell not to press Amendment 131, and if he does press it, I'd ask the members to oppose it. Amendment 218, in the name of Douglas Ross, spoken to by Mr Eagle. In regard to Amendment 218, the amendment made by the bill simply allows Nature Scott to sit on a panel as a member. It is not a requirement that they do so, and it is not our intention that they will sit on every panel. We can foresee that there may be circumstances in future where it would be beneficial for a relevant expert from Nature Scott to sit on a panel. It is in these circumstances that we would not want them to be prohibited from doing so. Panels must be... Allow me to finish my point and I'll come back to you. Panels must be approved by Scottish ministers, so I do not agree that there is any risk of a conflict of interest occurring, and it's for those reasons I would urge the committee to vote against those amendments. Yes, I'll take your intervention now.
He is saying here, in my understanding, that Nature Scott shouldn't have an involvement, but it's whether they sit on the panel or act as an observer to that panel. I guess they can always feed in their information, can't they? It's just not have that sort of powers beyond that, given that they're a regulatory body. And to stop any risk of a conflict of interest, why not just keep it as it is?
I don't... Going back to the point that Mr Mountain just made, he was quite clearly indicating that he didn't think that Nature Scott had the ability to walk the miles that a deer stalker may have done. I disagree. There will be expertise within Nature Scott. It's a very good organisation with a multiple expertise right across a number of sectors. So therefore, if there is experts within that organisation that will add value to any panel that has been set up, then I think that it is only right that they have the ability to do so, and I don't see any conflict because it would have to be directed by a minister in order to set the panel up in the first place. I should also point out, it was also part of the Deer Working Group report recommended the Deer Act 1996 should be amended to allow a member of Nature Scott to be a member of a panel in order to represent, as it was, Nature Scott's functions under the Natural Heritage Scotland Act 1991. So there is a good rationale for allowing this to happen, and I would urge members to oppose that part of the bill, that amendment that would take that out of the bill.
Thank you, Minister. Tim Eagle to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 215.
No further comments. Happy to press 215.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. The question is that Amendment 215 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 216 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 215. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Move.
So the question is that Amendment 216 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment, excuse me, I call Amendment 217 in the name of, I beg your pardon, I've jumped ahead of myself. I call Amendment 131 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with Amendment 215. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 131 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those opposed? Those wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 217 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 215. Tim Eagle, to move or not move?
Moved.
So the question is that Amendment 217 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Those wishing to abstain? The result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. The question is that Section 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. I call Amendment 28 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 215. Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has been moved, so we'll move to the question. And the question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hands now. Those members against? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 1 for, 8 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. I call Amendment 218 in the name of Douglas Ross, already debated with Amendment 215. Tim Eagle, to move or not move? Move. The question is that Amendment 218 be agreed to. Are we agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hand now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 2 for, 7 against. The amendment has therefore not been agreed. The question is that Section 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 132 in the name of Edward Mountain, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. And I point out that if Amendment 133 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 330, 225, 226, 227, 228, 229 and 230 down to preemption. Amendments 228 and 229 are direct alternatives, which means that they can both be moved and decided on. The text of whatever is the last agreed to is what will appear in the bill. Edward Mountain to move Amendment 132 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener, and you'll be pleased to know, Convener, that considering the size of this group, I will try and limit my what I say to the amendments that I'm moving in the group. And I'll start off by moving Amendment 132. Now, Amendment 132 would reinstate the stag season or close season for male deer in Scotland, following its removal by the Deer Close Season Scotland Amendment Order, which came into force on the 21st of October 2023. The committee will remember I spoke on this subject and drew up a large petition of people. Over 2,000 people signed the petition, which was then effectively ignored. What it meant was that not only could Bambi be shot with its mother, but every male deer would be shot during the course of the year whenever it was seen, if that was the decision of the landowner. Now, to be clear, I've done a bit of research on this and with Forestry Land Scotland, Convener, and what it's proved is that because they use what I call deer mercenaries, which I will come back to in a moment, 25,673 male deer have been shot in Scotland since the removal of the closed season, and those have been shot out of season. It is a huge number, 6,643 in the North Region or Highlands alone. Now, to be clear, Forestry Land Scotland have spent £4.86 million on deer management control in 2023-2024. These are used to pay contractors, some of which are being paid over £100,000 a year to kill deer. That, using the figures that they're using, are killing over 800 deer per contractor. Now, some contractors are using subcontractors and paying them a proportion of what they get from Scotland. And it equates to roughly 6% of FLS's total expenditure on deer management control. My issue with this is that this bill, the removal of the closed season, enticed people to go into contract deer killing. And I've made the point in the previous amendment, which sadly was rejected, that there was importance of keeping people on the ground, not using travelling contractors from out with the area to come in and kill deer. I would, of course, take an intervention.
I'm curious to understand, is your objection to the closed season as a result of bringing contractors in, or is it because you're against the provision of you want a provision for a closed season rather than an open season as it currently is?
Well,
what is the particular issue?
Okay, and I thank the Minister for that question. It's a very pertinent one. I've been involved in deer management, as I said, for over 50 years, the selective culling of deer to ensure that deer populations are maintained at a level that are acceptable, not just the mass extermination of deer. What the Act did, or what the order did, was say you could kill deer at any time. Now, there was provision under the Deer Act for the killing of deer out with the closed season, but you had to apply for licence and it could only be done in specific areas. Now it is being done randomly across Scotland. In fact, I saw advertisements for the killing of a stag, shooting of stags at Christmas, when the stags are at their lowest ebb, when they shouldn't be being chased around the hill because they're probably at the limits of their reserves before they go into the spring. And I think that's wrong. I'm all for the management of deer. I'm all for doing it carefully, as kindly as possible, and to ensure that you keep a balanced population. What I'm suggesting is that we go back to the situation where we were before, where licences had to be applied for, rather than just people carrying out night shooting using thermal sights when deer were being harried from dawn to dusk. And, Minister, if you want further examples of that, you could go to the deer management groups in the Highlands who were being ferried around at the expense of Nature Scott, using helicopters to go out to the most far-off places of a state, shooting deer, leaving them there, and only culling calves at a percentage of 1%, which would be completely against normal deer management, because we know that calving percentages are about 20 to 25%. So it meant that 19% of the calves were left to starve as a result of the actions of Nature Scott, something I find unacceptable. Of course I'd take an intervention.
What difference, I take the point that you've made about calves, but what difference would shooting male deer out of season or at any time of the year have on the effect of calves? Is the specific point that you're making not so much the closed season or an open season? Are you trying to make the point that you don't think that this is good for animal welfare overall? Is that your point?
It's both points. I think the ethics of deer control should be such that there should be a deer closed season. And I'm trying to prove to you, Minister, and to the members of public listening to this, that this government has lost their view and their way on the direction on ethics of deer control. And it's become a mass rush to kill as many deer as possible. If you don't believe me, Minister, you could speak to many of the game dealers in Scotland who have already at this stage said that they're no longer prepared to take deer in the run-up to Christmas because there's no market, their larders are full, they cannot sell them. And so deer will now either not be shot because they can't be taken in by game dealers, or where they are shot, may be left on the hill, or indeed not just put into chills, never to be used, or in fact destroyed. So I've pushed as hard as I can on that, Convener. I will move on to Amendment 133, which would remove Section 6 Zulu Bravo, I would say, in the army. I don't know if it's ZB or whatever, but it would extend a power to Nature Scott to intervene in deer management on the grounds of nature restoration. And amendments 134, 135, 138, 139, 148, 149, 150 and 151 are consequential to my amendment 133. Now, I believe that Section 67B's unchecked intervention power will destabilise the currently voluntary system, which accounts for 80% of Scotland's annual cull and will lead to job sectors. It would effectively allow Nature Scott ability to order culls and just send the bill to landowner. Now, we know, Minister, we know that deer are not the only animals that cause damage on hills. In fact, sheep, hares and even cows cause damage to hill. And SNH now would concentrate purely on deer and would have no control of the other species. And that questions, in fact, it's questioned to the extent that I believe your predecessor was told that it was bad legislation just to concentrate on deer. And I've just seen in the press this morning that, you know, some other people are controlling other animals. I see Oxygen Conservation are killing deer killing goats just on the whim that they don't want any goats. But what you've done in this legislation is allowed SNH just to concentrate on deer. Waste of time if you're not going to take a holistic management of the whole. Of course, Mr. Ruskell,
just to be clear then, I mean, are you arguing then that Nature Scott should have a role in terms of determining the level of livestock within a particular strath or area?
Well, I'm saying that, thank you, Mark, for that intervention. What I'm saying is concentrating on one species and not having a holistic approach is actually not really achieving very much. Therefore, I'd rather go back, as you suggested with your last amendment, Mr. Ruskell, which I supported and pushed to ensure it got through, that we have a holistic approach, which the Deer Commission Scotland had in the past. That's what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to do with this section. Amendment 142 obliges Scottish Minister to consult experts when planning objections to control scheme. My Amendment 143 further qualifies that these persons should be those who recognise the industry and have a relevant amount of expertise, rather than people who consider themselves fit by reading books or scientific papers. I want actually the people that consider and make judgments on this to have got dirt under their fingernails from actually managing deer rather than just reading about it. Amendment 145 and 146 offer two approaches when it comes to the scrutiny of deer controls agreements and control schemes. Amendment 145 would require Nature Scott to conduct a full financial and socio-economic impact assessment before exercising the functions, and move towards a control agreement must be informed by robust analysis. Surely that's the right way of going forward, making sure that economically it's viable rather than just causing a desert and no one there as a result of it. The impact assessment would report on the cost of the enhanced deer management, the burden on neighbouring landowners, ensure that the impact on deer management jobs for neighbouring properties is carried out in the control order. It's part of the holistic approach, the deer management plan approach, which considers the whole catchment rather than one catchment in particular. Introducing statutory requirements for socio-economic assessments would ensure the decisions are made with the full knowledge and of the consequences with those affected. Amendment 146 goes further than the Amendment 145, inserting two new sections, 8A and 8B, after Section 8 of the 1996 Act. This would create a statutory requirement for financial and socio-economic assessments, as in Amendment 145, but also would establish independent scrutiny of control agreements and control schemes by an independent panel of experts. That's got to be good. Bring in the experts, people who know about it and have actually done it. Currently, SNH has authority to implement control agreements or schemes to manage deer populations. However, the decisions and impacts on those measures on local economies, employment and the cost to landowners and business are often symptomatically not addressed or effectively scrutinised. The panel will do that scrutiny, and therefore I don't see why the Minister wouldn't do it. It would protect, of course, the Minister and the Scottish Government for any legal actions in the future if they hadn't considered all the things. I believe all of these amendments are vital to ensure control schemes are appropriately scrutinised and that the welfare of our deer are such that we are proud of that welfare and we're not just going out effectively to machine gun deer at the expense of everything else. And I think that's wrong. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I now call Tim Eagle to speak to Amendment 219 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Well, the Minister queried my questioning of the vagueness of Nature Scott in the previous section. And I would say, well, one, I don't think I did do that, but two, there's been a hell of a lot of discussion with stakeholders as we've moved into stage 2, and that's why I put on record at the beginning my desire to meet with the Minister to go through that, because words and language, I think, are important in this bill, because it will make all the difference in the practical application of it later on. And that's what I'm about to talk about now, and sorry, it is a bit at length, because I've got quite a lot of amendments in this group. My Amendment 219 is a drafting amendment relating to Amendment 329, which I will come to in a minute. Amendment 220, as currently drafted, Section 12 of the bill will replace the existing Code of Practice in the 1996 Act with a new Code of Practice. The current purpose of the Code in the Deer Scotland Act 1996 is to provide practical guidance in respect of deer management. The bill will add to that, making that it also involves the circumstances in which it will intervene in the management or control of deer. My Amendment 220 seeks to replace will with may, which feels more in the spirit of the purpose and intent of the Deer Code, which was intended to help managers understand what they must, should and could do to manage deer sustainably and encourage collaboration between different land managers. At present, the wording of the bill is prescriptive, direct and objective. The Code will set out the circumstances in which NatureScot must intervene. This leaves no room for manoeuvre. If the Code says it, NatureScot must do it. Such wording would expose NatureScot to lobbying and litigation, particularly from landholdings who consider that their neighbours are not doing enough to manage deer. This in turn will undermine the voluntary principle which underpins collaborative deer management. The effect of this amendment is to maintain the discretionary character of NatureScot's intervention powers under the 1996 Act, ensuring that the bill does not introduce an unintended obligation to act in every qualifying case. In the Stage 1 report, it states, the committee recognises the concerns from the deer management sector about the lack of detail around how new ground for intervention would be used. It is critical that the Scottish Government does not erode that trust and consensus that has been carefully built with the deer management sector in recent years. Yes.
Thank you for giving way. You mentioned that you're keen to maintain a voluntary approach, but you also acknowledge that this isn't always working with every community in terms of controlling deer numbers. Is the voluntary approach as it's been operated up until now adequate to deal with the problem?
I think my understanding is that the deer practitioners across Scotland are very keen to continue to work with Scotland to meet their objectives. And one of the things I've sort of think I've heard very clearly from stakeholders during discussions on Stage 2 is that they actually recognise some of the concerns and they're willing to work towards that. But if you put on a primary bill, a primary piece of legislation, very prescriptive amendments, that actually reduces that ability to have that proactive discussion in the background about how the government takes things forward. Amendment 329. In the Deer Scotland Act 1996, NatureScot are required to have regard to the Code of Practice on deer management. My amendments to 329 requires them instead to comply with as far as reasonably practical. The Code of Practice will now play a central role in defining the circumstances in which intervention will take place, and the current working may provide NatureScot with discretion to act in contravention of the Code. The committee recognised within the Stage 1 report that the concerns from the deer management sector about the lack of detail around how the new ground for intervention would be used. This amendment seeks to provide greater clarity to deer managers about the circumstances in which NatureScot will intervene. Yes, certainly.
Would the member accept that the Code of Practice is an ongoing process, closely delivered and developed with NatureScot in conjunction with the deer managements, the Association of Deer Managers? And the point that the member made right at the start of this, that language is really important, I absolutely agree. Language is incredibly important in how we take this bill forward. But there is, without doubt, a good purpose between all the stakeholders, including NatureScot, that collaboration is already working. So therefore, that's the kind of thing that we want to continue with, and that's already happening.
Yes, I'm actually not sure I disagree with much of that. I guess what I'm arguing here, or what I think I'm arguing here, and this is why it would be nice to sort of have a discussion behind the scenes after this, is that as it says at the moment, that have regard to the code means if loads of stakeholders are putting a lot of effort into working with NatureScot and the government to bring a code forward, but NatureScot only have to have regard to that, there is a concern that they might do something that stakeholders haven't felt they're part of. Does that make sense?
I understand the point the member is making, but there has only ever been one control order brought into place since 1996. This is not something that NatureScot can do on a whim. There is a whole process that they would have to go through in order to get to that position in the first place. So this merely adds an additional part that NatureScot can then intervene in. But that wouldn't take away from all of the things that NatureScot would have to do in order to get to that control order if they ever got to that. Because my hope and my expectation would be is that NatureScot would work with the land managers and the deer managers to find solutions to issues as and when they arose. surely that's something the member would agree with.
I do agree with that. Well, but I think that's, in some ways, that's maybe the probe that I wanted, in the sense that, I mean, I think I'll still push this, and I'll discuss this with you as well separately. But I think this is the crux of the issue here, is that there's a lot of wording in here, there's a lot of new stuff that's coming forward that I think stakeholders are really concerned about. And actually what it is about making sure that relationship, that sort of triangle relationship between government, Nature Scott as the regulator, and the stakeholders actually works in practice. And we'll come back to that, I imagine, as we move forward anyway. My Amendment 23223, the bill sets out changes to the Deer Scotland Act 1996, which explain grounds for intervention relating to damage by deer. It sets out the conditions that Nature Scott have to believe are satisfied before intervention can take place. It then states that the ground is met if in relation to a particular area of land. My Amendment 223 changes to a particular area of land to on a particular piece of land. At the moment, the bills use both terms, and I believe that this introduces a better consistency to the drafting of the bill, and I believe the use of on narrows the reference. My Amendment 224 is similar to Amendment 223, introducing a better consistency to the bill as currently drafted. My Amendment 330 is a consequential to my Amendments 223 and 224. Section 13 of the bill adds to the Deer Scotland Act 1996 grounds for intervention due to nature restoration. It currently states that the ground for intervention is met if, for a particular area of land, deer or steps not taken are likely to prevent or reduce the effectiveness of work, a project or natural process. This amendment deletes a project or natural process and replaces it simply with or project. As far as I am aware, natural process has not been defined in previous legislation, and therefore I do not believe it adds anything beyond that which would already be covered under work or project. Again, that's just trying to make sense in the law, with that practical application of the law. My Amendment 227 is a consequential amendment to my Amendment 228. Section 13, under Amendment 228, my Section 13 of the bill adds to the Deer Scotland Act 1996 grounds for intervention due to nature restoration. It currently states that the ground for intervention is met if, for a particular area of land, deer or steps not taken are likely to prevent or reduce the effectiveness of work, a project or natural process that preserves, protects, restores or enhances or otherwise improves the natural heritage or environment. My Amendment 228 deletes enhances or otherwise improves and replaces it with just and enhances. This is because I am concerned that allowing intervention on the basis of improving the natural heritage or environment is problematic, as there is no clear baseline against which such improvements can be measured. Removing the phrase "or otherwise improves" would ensure that deer management remains aligned with the established purposes of preserving, protecting, restoring and enhancing the environment, while avoiding ambiguity over what constitutes environmental improvement. Certainly. I need a break.
It is a fairly straightforward question. There's some debate, and I know the members trying to bring in a level of certainty over some of the decisions that Nature Scott might make. Is it the members' understanding that within the bill there is an obligation for Nature Scott to work with landowners before potentially bringing in an order, a control order?
Yes, that's my understanding. Yes. My Amendment 229 is similar to 228, changing and enhances to or enhances for the same reason. Apologies for some of the confusion of some of these. They are, again, these are wording changes that I'm trying to get across, the purpose of which is to bring the practical importance of the bill to light. My Amendment 230 seeks to remove the words "and environment" to avoid duplication and ensure clarity of purpose. The bill is focused on safeguarding Scotland's natural heritage, which already encompasses the ecological landscape and biodiversity aspects that would otherwise be captured by the broader term environment. This amendment therefore streamlines this provision without altering its substantive effect or limiting the scope of protections. Amendment 231, the bill's section 14 deals with deer management plans. It outlines what the plan should set out. This includes the measures that relevant owners and occupiers of the land consider should be taken in relation to the management of deer on the land. My amendment removes 231, the land, and replaces it with a particular area of the land. This is to ensure consistency of the wording across sections 13 to 15 of the bill. My Amendment 331 adds a new section to the bill, establishing a community-integrated deer management model. It would put a responsibility on a public authority, who is responsible for publicly owned land, to consider the possibility of the option of introducing such a model when they are preparing, reviewing any deer management plan. Functions of the public authority would include identifying publicly owned land where the model may be appropriate and engaging with local community groups. We are all agreed that the management, or I think we're all agreed, that the management of wild deer is essential. There are, of course, variable ideas on how deer management can be conducted. However, there is growing support for the idea of integrating communities in that management. This amendment would see trained stalkers managing deer in their local area and involving more locals from the community through the provision of training. This means that the knowledge of deer, the impacts and its benefits will be more widely known in a community. There are many benefits that could come from this, such as building resilience into the management framework, supporting the harvesting, processing and local consumption of a sustainable food source, and also assisting in protecting the environment, as well as helping the rural economy. Amendments 234 and 235. Section 15 of the bill deals with control agreements. It requires NatureScot to carry out functions after it has formed a view by stating it must. My amendments 234 and 235 simply replaces must with may in order to maintain the discretionary character of NatureScot's intervention powers under the Deer Scotland Act 1996, ensuring that the bill does not introduce an unintended obligation to act in every qualifying case. This will also address the concerns that the committee raised in our Stage 1 report, where we agreed that the committee recognises the concerns in the deer management sector about the lack of detail around how the new ground for intervention would be used. It is critical that the Scottish Government does not erode the trust and consensus that has been carefully built. In terms of Amendment 236, the Deer Scotland Act 1996 establishes control schemes. NatureScot are required to give notice relating to a control scheme. My Amendment 236 adds a new reasoning for that an independent panel has decided that a control scheme must be implemented. I believe that the broad powers of 6ZB and the potentially significant implications of the use of this regulatory intervention should require a panel of independent advisers, similar to the composition of the previous Deer Commission Board, to be appointed to provide advice to SNH, the Minister, and oversight of the process. My Amendment 237 seeks to remove the ability for NatureScot to extend the time limit of the control scheme. As currently drafted, I believe that the bill gives NatureScot too much power to extend the time limit, which will have significant downstream economic consequences. Yes, please.
Would the member accept that the extension of the timing of a control scheme is to actually give the land manager time to actually achieve the objectives in the first place? So it's actually to the benefit of the landowner in actually achieving the aims.
See, now I didn't read it as that, but I'm happy to take that.
There's an awful lot of things that Tim Eagle has said. I think there'd be much value in us having an extensive conversation after this session. There's an awful lot of things that I think we could get to some agreement on. But that would be how I would approach the amendment that you've just spoken about.
I completely agree with you, Minister. There would be a huge value in us speaking behind this. I think what I'm trying to do is raise these points now, as would normally be the case, and then I would welcome that discussion, because these are very technical points. My Amendment 238 and 244 both seek to remove the requirement to register in the Land Register of Scotland, or as the case may be, record in the General Register of Sasines, and replace it with a requirement to publish on NatureScot's or SNH's website. This change will ensure increased public accessibility, and by removing it from the title sheet, mean that it is not legally tied to the land. That was a concern I raised during Stage 1, which is in line with other parts of the operation of the control scheme, which are also on NatureScot's website. I consider that this amendment simplifies the process, making information more accessible and transparent. My Amendment 245, Section 10 of the Deer Scotland Act 1996, sets out the emergency measures to prevent damage by deer. That ability applies currently when deer are causing damage to woodland or to agricultural production, including any crops or foodstuff. The bill proposes to add in the natural heritage or the environment. My amendment seeks to delete environment, again, because the term environment introduces broad, overarching objectives that reflect national rather than local priorities. I'm nearly there, Convener. My Amendment 232 is to act as a replacement to Alistair Allen's MSP's Amendment 39. Alistair Allen's Amendment 39 seeks to expand the rights of occupiers to prevent damage by deer. However, in doing so, I believe the amendment creates a significant safety issue for both landlord and occupier, as well as any employees of either party. The issue... certainly, yep.
Thank you for giving way. I'm sure you're about to explain this, but I'm unclear why it would be that tenants would not have to live by all the same rules and expectations around safety as their landlords.
Hopefully I'll explain that in what I'm about to say, but I can come back to you on that. The issue stems from the fact that the occupier can kill deer without notifying the landlord, provided they have reasonable grounds to believe the killing of deer is necessary to prevent damage. This could conceivably lead to a situation where agents of the landlord and occupier are undertaking deer management or other land management activities on the same piece of land at the same time, at significant risk to the safety of both parties. This amendment retains the expanded rights to kill deer on arable land, improved permanent pasture, land which has been regenerated so as to be able to make a significant contribution to the productivity of a holding, which forms part of that agricultural land and enclosed woodland. However, for other types of land, the amendment makes the exercising of such expanded rights conditional on an authorisation from NatureScot. NatureScot would give notice of the authorisation to the landlord, and thereafter the occupier would be subject to standard authorisation conditions, which includes notification requirements, which I believe the occupier carry out at present. My Amendment 333 will add a new section to the bill and the Deer Scotland Act 1996. It would require ministers to establish a financial assistance scheme for deer management activities. My amendment seeks to underscore the importance of providing meaningful incentives in support of sustainable deer management. It is widely considered by stakeholders from across the deer sector and beyond that financial incentives are essential, particularly in a lowland context. My amendment builds on existing pilot schemes in the Central Belt, Loch Ness and the Cairngorm National Park to put in place a statutory duty to incentivise sustainable deer management in Scotland. And finally, Amendments 310 and 311, as currently drafted, the bill will establish a new code of practice on deer management, something we spoke about very widely during Stage 1 discussions. However, we have no idea at present what will be in the code, and it will not be made clear until after the passing of this Act. My Amendments 310 and 311 would mean that all parts of the bill relating to deer could not come into force until the new code has been publicised. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call Beatrice Wishart to speak to Amendment 222 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener, and can I thank the Minister and his officials for time we had to discuss some of what I'm about to speak to now. Amendment 222 seeks to reduce the time period in which compliance with the Deer Management Code of Practice is reviewed from 10 years to 5. Given the expanded role of the Code to now set out the circumstances in which NatureScot will intervene in the management and control of deer, it would seem appropriate to ensure a review of compliance is conducted earlier than the 10-year backstop prescribed in Section 12 of the Bill. I understand that the last review of compliance was conducted in 2019. A review can be carried out, if required to do so, by ministers or within such a period as NatureScot considers appropriate. However, to ensure the Code is fulfilling the functions agreed by Parliament, it does not seem unreasonable to mandate that the review of compliance is completed once every 5 years as opposed to 10. If there are problems with the Code and ministers or NatureScot choose not to conduct a review, deer managers could be left to operate with the deficient Code until 2035. Amendment 225 relates to the new ground for NatureScot to intervene in the management and control of deer. During Stage 1, the committee heard concerns from the deer sector about the uncertainty surrounding the new ground for intervention based on nature restoration. It was also noted and underlined in the committee's Stage 1 report that ministers must ensure that they do not erode trust and consensus that has paved the way for voluntary and collaborative deer management. Amendment 225 is designed to help alleviate some of the uncertainty that's inherent in the new ground for intervention by clarifying that intervention will only be permissible where there is a material reduction in the effectiveness of works, projects or natural processes as a consequence of deer impacts or a lack of deer management. The amendment will ensure that NatureScot focuses on situations where the impact by deer is material and tangible. At present, the word reduce is unqualified, which I recognise as generating concern in the deer sector. My intention is to provide clarity about when NatureScot will step in. Amendment 232 increases the timescale for submitting a deer management plan from 3 months to 6 months. The bill currently proposes a 3-month timescale for deer management plans to be submitted. Members will be aware that such plans are generally created at the landscape scale, covering the entirety of the landmass in a given deer management group. This amendment is based on information from Scottish Lands and Estates and the Association of Deer Management Groups. Both organisations have confirmed that for some deer management groups, the 3-month period is not achievable. Some deer management groups have as many as 40 land holdings with multiple objections. Both organisations note that 6-month constitutes half of the time currently available to create and submit a deer management plan. My amendment therefore still results in a meaningful reduction in the time available, but in a way that would be workable and reasonable for the deer sector. Yeah.
And I appreciate the member already knows this because of the engagement we had before, but I want to put this point on the record. That 3-month timescale is not, it's an ability for Nature Scott to have a 3-month timescale on the basis that we will have some land managers who simply will not engage, who will simply have nothing to do with any kind of deer management plan being put in place. The vast majority of deer managers will actively engage and they won't require, they will get the extension of time that they need, and that could be up to 6 months, it could be up to 9 months, as long as Nature Scott know that they're getting engagement. The 3-month is for those landowners, land managers who are simply refusing to engage, and that allows Nature Scott to take action more promptly. And I basically want to put that on the record. I know that the member understands that, but I basically want to put it on the record so that that's a clear understanding to land managers as to what the purpose of that 3-month timescale is.
Thank you, Minister. Amendment 239 relates to the application and interpretation of control schemes, which constitutes the highest tier of regulatory intervention relating to deer management. The significant and wide-ranging implications of a control scheme means careful consideration must be given to what constitutes a relevant person. Relevant persons first and foremost receive notice of the proposal and then notice of confirmation of a proposal. Relevant persons are also entitled to a right of appeal against the terms, conditions and decisions to make, vary or revoke a control scheme. The present definitions for relevant persons in the context of a control scheme are deficient. It covers the owner or occupier of land upon whom a control scheme proposes to impose actions, or when a control scheme is already in place, proposes to impose actions. The implications of a control scheme will not be confined to the owner or occupier of land where the control scheme applies. As deer are not confined to land ownership boundaries, it's reasonable to expect that other land holdings and businesses will be implicated as a consequence of a control scheme being imposed. The committee has heard that deer stalking is an important income generator for rural businesses. An absence of deer which curtails stalking may, in many cases, result in a loss of jobs. Amendment 239 proposes adding an owner or occupier for the time being of land reasonably expected to be affected by the terms of the scheme to the definition of relevant persons. This amendment has been drafted with input from Senior Legal Counsel and Scottish Land and Estates to ensure that all holdings which are reasonably expected to be impacted receive notice and appeal rights. Amendments 242 and 243 relate to the consideration of objections by experts in relation to control schemes. The objection process is important to ensure that any compliance issues with the processes followed by Nature Scott or the substantive content of a control scheme are addressed before the right to appeal to the Scottish Land Court is engaged. Substantive objections may be referred to experts appointed by Scottish ministers. My amendments mean that Scottish ministers would need to consult Nature Scott and such other persons as they consider appropriate before appointing experts, as well as such persons as the Scottish ministers consider to represent the interests of relevant persons. The amendments are designed to promote trust and confidence in the objections process by ensuring that representatives of relevant persons are consulted about any appointment of experts to consider an objection. Amendment 251 establishes a single deer management data dashboard for Scotland as a means to record, collate and publish data relating to deer management in Scotland. Good monitoring data and other relevant information is the bedrock of informing and delivering sustainable deer management and appropriate cull levels. In most other European countries, such data is readily available to wildlife management practitioners in a fully open and transparent way. The intention with the amendment is to create a means to bring together data on deer and deer management under one format to be shared widely so there can be a unified process of data management and presentation that engages everyone with an interest in deer management. And I think that would also help with the polarisation issue that the Minister mentioned earlier on. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. I'll now move on to Rhoda Grant to speak to Amendment 68 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I'll speak to my amendment 68, 69, 136, 137, 140, 141, 147 and 70. Amendment 69 seeks to create a lowland deer management plan. The species and the way they're managed in lowland Scotland is very different from that in Highland Scotland, and land ownership patterns are different too, and therefore responsibility for deer is different. And stakeholders have told me that they're concerned that the bill appears to be focused on Highland deer management, but does little to control increasing numbers of lowland deer, and that's why we need a lowland deer management plan to keep deer numbers in check. Amendments 136, 137, 140, 141 seek to introduce clear timescales to different stages for the Section 7 and 8 processes to add transparency to Section 7 process. Currently, Nature Scott's use of Section 7 and Section 8 statutory intervention powers lacks transparency and therefore is not in line with its own shared principles for wildlife management. The Cairnlochan Section 7 voluntary control intervention in the Cairngorms National Park by Nature Scott has lasted over 25 years, and it has not delivered the required reduced deer densities on the ground. Only 1 out of 11 Section 7 agreements is concluded successfully. This group of amendments would set clear timescales for Nature Scott to consider use of its statutory intervention powers around deer management and to publish their views. This will encourage swifter decision-making. Interested parties and the public will be able to better track progress with action by Nature Scott. Amendment 147 creates a new section in the bill which would allow any concerned person to ask SNH or Nature Scott to intervene or reduce deer numbers. High levels of deer browsing and trampling can cause significant damage to gardens, crops, woodlands and land management for nature restoration because deer, as we know, don't respect property boundaries. This amendment would give those impacted by deer a formal process to ask Nature Scott to help resolve their concerns and use statutory powers to reduce deer numbers. Nature Scott would not necessarily have to intervene, however, they must give a good reason for not intervening. The confidentiality specified in subsection 3 is included to cover circumstances of a community or an estate whistleblower. This would not normally apply to a local authority, community council, NGO or other formal body if, should they make such a request. The amendment allows an appeal to the land court if action isn't taken. Amendments 68 and 76 seek to do something similar, but specifically only for farmers and crofters. Extending their current powers allows them to take problem deer on land other than their cultivated land. And if they're not able to do that or don't wish to do that, they can ask SNH to take action to prevent damage to their crops and livelihoods. Alistair Allen's Amendment 39 does something similar, so I will listen to the debate. But I suppose the two things I think are missing from Alistair Allen's amendment is that not everybody concerned or impacted might be able to take action themselves. And therefore they would need a route to ask Nature Scott to intervene. And it is not always crofters and farmers. It can be someone, for example, who has a market garden that may be impacted by problem deer and would need to maybe take steps if not confident themselves to intervene and take deer.
Thank you. Now move on to Rachel Hamilton to speak to Amendment 233, another amendment.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 233 introduces a requirement for local authorities to manage deer on their land, including requiring local authorities to consult with Transport Scotland and Bear Scotland regarding safety on roads. They must also publish a report on the number of road traffic accidents involving deer. And this may, I believe, answer the question as to whether the current interventions or the current, for example, warning signs work and how effective interventions are in reducing collisions. There's an estimated 1,850 there's an estimated 1,850 collisions involving traffic and deer, which have occurred every year in Scotland since 2016, with Nature Scott highlighting that May and June were the highest risk months for collisions. To register my own interest in this amendment, in October 2021, my daughter had a very bad car accident involving a deer, where the car was a write-off and she had significant injuries. But Nature Scott admit that recorded driver vehicle collisions are likely to be underestimated as they are underreported. And I know that too because another friend had a collision and it was equally quite distressing, but he did not report that because there were no significant injuries. It has also been estimated that more than 17 million is spent every year in the UK on vehicle repairs because of deer collisions. And this amendment improves road safety. It saves money for the NHS, but it also improves workforce productivity because it ensures that people don't take time off work. And it helps local authorities, as I said, to respond with appropriate measures.
I wonder if the member will take an intervention.
I will.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. One of the issues with deer is in the winter, especially along, say, for example, the A9, is they move down to the A9 to eat the lush grass that is on the roadside edges and to scavenge for the salt that's there. So one of the things that could be done is, as well as just controlling deer, is identifying areas which need additional fencing to improve road safety in the same way that we identify crash barriers in areas where people move from one side of the road to the other, or could. Does the member think that that should be considered as well?
Well, I think that the amendment to ask local authorities to produce a report on the number of road traffic accidents, obviously working with those other bodies as well, will ultimately result in the local authorities understanding where best to put the interventions and the safety measures. I just believe that obviously we're here to debate deer, and the number of deer are increasing and they are going onto roads, and I think it has become a wider problem. The figures state that the numbers are increasing, and I just think it's important that we recognise how we can best and effectively intervene to improve road safety. Yes.
Thank you. I'm very sympathetic to this amendment, and I face that daily challenge of looking to see where the deer's going to head out of the forest next, when I'm driving home. But I'm just wondering, where do local deer management groups, where does Nature Scott sit within this? Because I could see a conversation with Bear Scott and local authorities, and I'm just interested about where that advice around wider deer management comes in and how we kind of knit this together. Because putting up signs is one thing, but considering, as Mr. Mountain suggested, fencing, or how this relates to culling in particular areas, or the management of deer throughout the year is something else that is technical and more about land managers and the wider kind of efforts to manage deer populations in an area.
I thank Mark Ruskell for that amendment, and obviously Bear and Transport Scotland and Nature Scott and local authorities, they all work collaboratively together at the moment. I don't believe that all local authorities have deer management plans. There are some. I believe in East Ayrshire, for example, but not all of them do. And I think this, and the data that is collected from Nature Scott is really important, but that data is not overlaid, and this could widen the ability for local authorities to understand where the problem is. I think at the moment we are going in blind. We need to improve road safety. I mean, if I give the example, and I thank you for being sympathetic to this amendment, because it is really important to me, because I've seen the effects that it's had on my daughter. She had weeks off work, she had anxiety, she had to seek counselling, and she ultimately left her job because she was not confident in driving. And I think there are many people that wrote to me after that incident, and we do need to have measures to improve what is happening currently, even though there is this data being collected. It's not being used effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, I'm aware that we've had 5 speakers in this group and we have another 5 to go. Given it's 12:30, I seek your approval to suspend now until 6 o'clock because it'd be unlikely we'll get through this group till well after 1 and that doesn't take into consideration the voting. So unless there's any dissenting voices, I would like to suspend until 6 o'clock this evening. Okay, I take that as approval. So I suspend this meeting.